Imagine, oil monarchs, nothing happens, there is a lot of money and they can pursue some kind of independent policy. And they must guide the dependent. To do this, they must launch American bases on their territory. And therefore, the Americans are engaged in a very long struggle for influence in this region. This struggle did not begin in the 90s. It started much earlier. It began at the beginning of the 20th century, and then the struggle was for control of Iran. We will not analyze all the steps of this big game, we will start with the Iranian Revolution. In 1979, a revolution occurred in Iran. Why we started with this, you will now understand. In 1979, the Americans created a big problem for themselves with their own money. At that moment, the Shah ruled Iran. It was a secular regime, in general, a rather unique regime. He was quite totalitarian. It was also a monarchy. There was a very serious and very tough security service, which, by the way, was brought up by the Americans. But, as they say, the Shah wanted a lot. It was necessary to carry out a certain modernization of this regime for a very simple reason. The fact is that the Soviet Union sent troops to Afghanistan in 1979. Do you see how one event clings to another? And the Americans needed to use someone else's hands to fight our army in Afghanistan. They didn't come up with anything better for this than the Islamic factor. But the secular regime in Iran had to be replaced by a more religious one, which would actively begin to intervene in events in Afghanistan, and, together with the Pakistanis, finance, arm and conduct direct clashes with the Soviet army. Therefore, the Americans are organizing a kind of Arab Spring in Iran. But the situation is very sad for them. Events get out of control, a real revolution results, as a result of which, if you remember, hostages are taken at the American embassy and Americans are generally pushed out of Iran. That is, it turns out that they paid for their own expulsion from a country that has significant oil reserves with their own money. Agree, it's a shame. This is why they still hate Iran so much. But the Americans are immediately trying to take revenge. They are trying to get the hostages back. There was a special operation, the helicopters were flying, they broke down, nothing worked, they crashed. In short, the Americans have disgraced themselves. This marked the end of President Carter's political career. President Reagan came in the next election. But the Americans did not give up their desire to punish Iran. And then in Iraq they helped to come to power. And Iraq was ruled by the military, a certain party, the Ba'ath Party. Another small one, I would even say, not a coup, but a revolution, and they bring their agent named Saddam Hussein to power. He comes to power, lo and behold, in the same 79th, almost in the 80th year. And in the same year of 1980, under a far-fetched pretext, he immediately started a war with Iran. This war lasted 10 years, from 1980 to 1990. More than 1 million people died. That is, for these states this is a very serious war. At the same time, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the Iranian army. He will eventually be hanged, as you know, for using chemical weapons against civilians. But even then he used chemical weapons, and the world community did not draw any conclusions from this. The world situation at that time was very interesting. Since Iran, although having expelled the Americans, began to oppose the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, then when the war began between pro-American Iraq and independent Iran, not only the Americans supplied weapons to Saddam Hussein and gave him money, but the Soviet Union also supplied him with weapons, because it was also necessary for him to punish Iran and weaken it, and accordingly Iran weakened its assistance to the Mujahideen who were in Afghanistan. That is, the interest of the Soviet Union and America coincided for a short period of time. Very interesting. 10 years of war, colossal losses. The reason for the war, ownership of oil fields, is a classic. The country is bleeding, both Iran and Iraq. The war ends in a draw. And then, naturally, Saddam Hussein comes to his American masters with a simple question, guys, I fought for you for 10 years, I need to somehow reward myself. Well, not yourself, but Iraq. They tell him, please, you can annex Kuwait. Kuwait is an oil field, small country, there is actually no army. But there are historical reasons. Because this entire Middle Eastern zone is a zone where the borders do not have any historical roots. After the Second World War, they were all cut up by the British completely arbitrarily. There are no deep historical roots. Both Iraq and Kuwait were once one country. Therefore, there are historical reasons. This means that the Americans give the go-ahead to Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein sends his troops into Iran, realizing that nothing will happen to him for this. But the Americans need to create the very problem that we talked about. And so they use Saddam's troop entry as a pretext to invade the region. That is, roughly speaking, they are scamming him. They scam people like timber makers scam people on the street. Send in troops and nothing will happen to you. He enters. They begin to attack him and demand. What's interesting here? He, realizing where he was being dragged, began to declare that he was ready to withdraw troops from Iran. They refused to talk to him and immediately began the military Operation Desert Storm. Because the task was to create a military conflict and create problems for surrounding states. By the way, during the Iraq-Iranian War there was generally great tension in this region, because very often military aircraft and military operations interfered with the passage of tankers, and aircraft bombed tankers. That is, there were constant clashes of some kind, and this region was very turbulent. It was at this moment that the Americans established a large number of their bases there in order to cover, for example, Saudi Arabia from the military conflict between Iraq and Iran. That is, they themselves created the problem and, under this guise, got into this region themselves. But they needed more from Saddam Hussein. They needed to organize a demonstrative flogging and generally escalate the situation in this region. But having created a problem, it cannot be completely solved. This is an important understanding that will help us not to be surprised that the Americans did not finish off Saddam at that time. What happened? Saddam Hussein realized that he would be punished, and an agreement was reached with him. This is also an important point. They agreed with him once again that the Americans would bomb his army. He will put her in danger. For this he will not be deprived of power, and the Americans will not enter Iraq. What happens next? The Americans, the British, this entire so-called coalition begins to hammer the Iraqi army located in Kuwait. They hit with impunity. It actually does not resist. In my opinion, this coalition suffered meager losses, or none at all. Iraq has very heavy losses. They go, there is no resistance. The Iraqi army is demoralized. At this moment, the Shiites, the Shiite minority of Iraq, and the Kurds, who do not understand the larger geopolitics, begin an uprising. Because what does the situation look like for them? Now the American liberators will come and free us from the bloody regime of Saddam. They don't know what they agreed with Saddam. These are rebelling. Saddam Hussein uses chemical weapons to quickly end this war. Why is he not afraid to use chemical weapons at that moment? Because he has already agreed with the Americans, and he knows that now they will not notice it. Although, you understand that giving such a reason is simply a gift for the Americans. For comparison, remember the situation with Syria. Imagine, the Americans dream of bombing Syria, and at this moment Bashar al-Assad actually uses chemical weapons against the rebels. This is a gift to America. Really, a gift. For some reason, Saddam Hussein was not afraid. The Kurdish rebellion was suppressed. The Shiite rebellion was suppressed. In both cases, chemical weapons were used against militants, probably too, but the civilian population suffered greatly as well. The Americans do not go inside Iraq, the war ends, sanctions are imposed against Iraq. The sanctions are very interesting. They were called oil for food. That is, Iraq was prohibited from supplying oil to the world market. But the Americans are kind people, so the UN agreed that Iraq can carry out humanitarian supplies. Because it is necessary to bring medicine, for example, to Iraq, some important things that Iraq itself does not produce, and this can only be bought for foreign currency. This means that Iraq must be given the opportunity to sell oil and receive foreign currency. But here everything is done more cunningly. Iraq ships oil to certain international intermediaries, and these international intermediaries sell the oil, purchase goods, and import goods into Iraq. That is, money does not concern Iraq. He does not receive any money, he receives goods. The funny thing is that only after shipping the oil will Iraq find out at what price it shipped it. A very confusing scheme. Vladimir Wolfovich Uranovsky even spoke about this at one time, that a huge number of officials at the UN earned colossal money. Because, roughly speaking, they could set any price at which Iraq would ship oil. This price was still lower than the exchange price, and sometimes much lower than the exchange price. This was such a corruption trough, made by the UN, or more precisely, by the Americans for the UN, so that the UN would not notice the nuances that arise there. We can immediately look at the situation of the second destruction of Saddam Hussein, so that it is clear. The Americans invade Iraq amid terrorist attacks in New York. I have no doubt that they themselves blew up their twin houses, they themselves hit the Pentagon with a missile, and they themselves brought down the airliner in which people were supposedly fighting terrorists. I only have one question: where are the people who were sitting on the plane? I'll explain why. We, without even examining the details of the strange behavior of these twin towers, the destruction of which clearly resembles the situation when a building is liquidated and blown up. They were built exactly the same. I'll just remind you of two facts. There was a third building, which no one crashed into and which collapsed in the same way a few hours after the first two. You can look, these records are on the internet. There is little talk about this. There was such a house. He is not tall. It happened to be the offices of the IRS, the FBI, and some other people. People were evacuated from this building, although there was no reason for this. And so, the building stood, and suddenly, it happened like this. That is, roughly speaking, they planted explosives in it, but the plane did not arrive. Excess of performance. But they forgot not to detonate the explosives, and therefore they didn't explain anything to anyone. They just seemed to take me out of the information field. You can find information on the internet. There is a live broadcast from CNN, a correspondent is standing, and suddenly this house folds behind him. This correspondent's eyes become huge. Because he doesn't understand why there is no plane, but the house is folded. This is the first fact. The second fact is why we can say that people were killed. Because the plane that supposedly crashed into the Pentagon left behind one round entrance hole. Although you and I are far from aircraft construction, we still realize that airplanes have wings. So, if a plane crashes with its wings into some building, then there will be damage at the level of the wings, and not just at the level of the fuselage. There he somehow neatly folded them and flew inside. At the same time, there is no luggage, no debris, nothing. They always say, everything burned down. But at the same time, please note, the DNA of the passengers was preserved. Therefore, they were able to identify all the passengers. That is, nothing remained of the plane, but the DNA remained. It turns out to be nonsense. The lawn in front of the Pentagon, there is nothing there, no luggage, nothing. Look at the crash site of any plane, scattered remains, suitcases, a terrible sight. There is a clean lawn there, you can even play golf now. Therefore, it was not a plane that crashed into the Pentagon. The question arises, where is the plane? Where are the people, the passengers who were on this plane? This means that they were somehow liquidated, something was done with them. Maybe someday these questions will be answered. These terrorist attacks are happening. The United States invades Afghanistan. Why go to Afghanistan? We'll talk to you now, and invade Iraq. To find a reason to invade Iraq, what do they say then? Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons. And he also has bacteriological weapons. In general, he has everything. We urgently need to disarm him. You remember that chemical weapons were never found. They didn't even bother to bring it with them so they could find it there later. But, apparently, the Soviet Union no longer existed, and they felt so free from international law, which we see today, that even, as they say, they themselves said that there were chemical weapons, they didn't find them, but oh well. They are still there. By the way, Barack Obama said that he would withdraw troops from Iraq. When he ran for his first term, he promised to withdraw troops from Iraq. Nothing of the sort happened. As you can see, the Americans are still there. So, they invented a reason. The former reason was the presence of some weapons, and the presence of a certain threat from Iraq. Although you and I understand that Saddam Hussein, after his face was slammed on the table after Kuwait, he, of course, behaved more quietly than water, below the grass. But he made one big mistake. Even before this, he stated that he would trade oil only for Iraqi dinars, for Iraqi currency, that is, not for dollars. And of course, they absolutely could not forgive him for this. The Americans sent troops to Iraq. Further, you remember that the Iraqi generals and Saddam Hussein himself spoke about the colossal losses that they would have. Instead, the Iraqi army somehow suddenly dissolved. She went home and was neither heard nor seen. That is, the Americans but the generals, Saddam Hussein himself hid, his sons were killed, after a while they caught him and tried him. Here they got hold of those facts of the use of chemical weapons that they themselves had not noticed 10 years before, and hanged him. And thus, as they say, ends in the water. Note: Saddam Hussein was overthrown. Has anything good happened in Iraq? Peace? No. Not to mention the fact that there is a partisan struggle going on there against the Americans and those who collaborate with the Americans. They call it terrorists now. Although with the same success one can call the Belarusian partisans terrorists during the years 1941 to 1945. And the Germans called them that, bandits and terrorists. You and I understand that this was a liberation movement and partisans. In the same way, those who are fighting for the withdrawal of Americans from Iraq, what kind of terrorists are there? These are freedom fighters. But the Americans are already bringing the seeds of Al-Qaeda there. Today in Iraq there are battles between the Iraqi state army and certain military formations that want to build on Iraqi territory, including some kind of Islamic state. I think Iraq and the Levant, that's what it was called. That is, there is no peace on Iraqi soil. The Americans brought neither freedom, nor democracy, nor prosperity there. A large number of Iraqis died. WikiLeaks published documents that 100,000 Iraqis died. I think more of them died. That is, 100,000, at least, the Americans themselves admitted, they gave their lives for what? For there to be no Saddam Hussein. Little consolation. They are chaoticizing this region, not leaving Iraq and continuing to plunge it into chaos. But Iraq was the first part. Next came Libya. Then came Syria. Weapons are traveling to Syria through Lebanon. But it comes mainly from Iraq, that is, from the Americans. Accordingly, Iraq became a springboard for destabilizing the entire region. It was the Americans who stuck their foot into the door and then climbed in, as they say, with their whole body. That's what they did in Iraq. Now we return to the military conflict that they imposed in Afghanistan. You and I will not move according to the chronology of American aggressions, because our task is to understand their causes. And you can always look up or read the start date of any war. So why did they get into Afghanistan? I would like to ask you a question. I'm wondering what your point of view is. Who's ready to answer? Why did the Americans get involved in Afghanistan? After all, there is no oil in Afghanistan. What is there in Afghanistan? Answer: chaos. They are again according to the old system. Starikov, I agree, they want chaos. But before we understand where they would direct this chaos, you and I must understand that Afghanistan is not only a place of contact through Central Asia with Russia. This is where they touch Pakistan, this is the border with Iran, and this is actually the border with China. That is, the amazing strategic position makes it possible for a number of important geopolitical players to spoil things at once while in Afghanistan. First of all, of course, Russia and China, Iran, create difficulties in India and keep Pakistan in suspense. You know that American drones constantly fly into Pakistan and simply kill people there without any announcement. And this has been happening for many years. Accordingly, they can keep the situation in Pakistan in a kind of simmering state, because a very specific infrastructure always develops around war. You understand perfectly well that the Americans came to Afghanistan to grow drugs there. During their stay in Afghanistan, drug production increased 66 times. Imagine that the reason for the invasion of the United States of America, as they say, was the desire to stop drugs being produced there. Imagine a disco where the drug squad comes and they sell 66 times as much drugs at that disco. The question arises, are the goals of this anti-drug squad declared correctly? Maybe he has a different goal. To sell more drugs. Of course, the drugs were actually eliminated by the Taliban. The Americans came, dispersed the power of the Taliban and began to protect drug production. At the same time, the explanations are, well, childishly naive. When Russia says that this business needs to be stopped, they say, we can't, because there are peasant families there. What would they eat if they don't do drugs? Well then, allow yourself to grow drugs too. There are also families there. You have unemployment in the USA. That is, if you follow this logic, any crime can be resolved. After all, everyone has families. Old mothers, we need to take care of them somehow. Simply amazing. They do not hesitate to make such statements. Drugs are grown and these drugs are sent further into Russia. You know that a huge number of people in our country, especially young people, unfortunately, die from these drugs, because the borders are transparent. We cannot stop all drugs. Drugs are being brought into China. In China it's tougher, they shoot you for drugs, but they still import them. And Iran is generally interesting. Iran built a 3-meter wall, and before that it dug a ditch 3 meters deep, so that the Americans could not break through. There was a whole military operation there. They were dropped in by helicopters. Some powerful trucks were used to bring drugs into Iran. That is, the Americans have gained a foothold there and are beginning to destroy the youth of all neighboring countries. In addition, having separated Kosovo from Yugoslavia, they transport drugs on a direct flight from Afghanistan to Kosovo, where cars arrive and transport drugs directly across Europe. Fast and good. As a matter of fact, Kosovo has a very large military base, one of the main purposes of which is the distribution of drugs in Europe. And drugs are crime control. This is black money that can be used from any side, and this is control over these government agencies. You know that Kosovo is an Albanian mafia, which, surprisingly, is protected by power in European countries for some reason. It is not eradicated, although this is not such a big difficulty. That's why they are in Afghanistan. Now they are declaring that they will leave Afghanistan. But what does it mean to leave Afghanistan? This means that they are leaving about 30,000 people there, and they will sit at key bases, controlling them. Even now they don't move much, so they suffer significantly fewer losses than the Soviet army, which practically controlled all of Afghanistan, and most of the losses were in military clashes when we moved around the country. These were ambushes, these checkpoints were attacked. You've probably seen it in movies and read books on this topic. The Americans are sitting on well-guarded bases, so their losses are small. But, to be honest, they are quite comparable to the losses of the Soviet army, especially given the fact that we achieved much greater success there in Afghanistan. So they remain at about 30,000 in Afghanistan. They are starting to finance the Taliban. They begin to give money and weapons to those with whom they fought. And they direct this fundamentalism to Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, partly to Kazakhstan, and probably to Kyrgyzstan. Here's their plan for the near future. That is, we all thought, in this case I'm talking about those who are engaged in analytics, that events in Afghanistan would happen earlier than events in other parts adjacent to the borders of Russia. But we see that the Americans are improvising, taking advantage of the emerging situation. They tried to destabilize the situation in the Middle East, partly it worked, partly it didn't. This slowed down their withdrawal from Afghanistan. Please note that they are now constantly saying that they are delaying the withdrawal of troops. And they switched. They started destabilizing in Ukraine instead of destabilizing in Afghanistan, instead of destabilizing in Tajikistan. That is, all this is adjusted along the way. But until they are fully prepared to destabilize Syria and the region, they cannot leave Afghanistan. So, we have dealt with Afghanistan. What else do we have? We must also, of course, remember Yugoslavia. Its dismemberment began even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in this sense, Yugoslavia was for the Americans and their allies a kind of testing ground for method of dismembering a large multinational country. They worked them out. Because the Soviet Union is a very large country, there are a large number of nationalities, and they were not ready to begin dismantling the Soviet Union without having trained anywhere. They didn't come up with anything better than dismantling Yugoslavia first. The Yugoslav dismantling scenario was very bloody. You know that a civil war began there on the principle of all against all, which resulted in the disintegration of the state into many parts, large casualties and colossal tension in this region. Until now, relations between states there are very, very specific. The situation especially worsened after the Americans, in violation of international law, cut off the Kosovo region from Serbia and declared it an independent state. For what? We have already discussed, in order to get a piece of territory in the center of Europe that would belong practically exclusively to them. Please note that there, in Yugoslavia, the Americans did not bring anything good. Small parts of Yugoslavia did not become very prosperous states. Just recently, against the backdrop of the situation in Ukraine, we were shown burning Sarajevo. Bosnia gained independence, so what? Western investors came, closed all the factories, bankrupted them, bought everything out, opened office centers, leaving people with nowhere to work. That is, the same you see that our Ukrainian colleagues, not all, of course, some, want to join, it has already shown itself there, in Bosnia. The same thing will happen in Ukraine, the closure of enterprises. As a matter of fact, today's putschist government assumes obligations to the IMF. And they always have obligations in one direction, reduction of pensions, reduction of social benefits, increase in tariffs. The IMF never proposes anything other than lower living standards and privatization. This is the so-called shock therapy. It was first used under Pinochet in Chile. It is always accompanied by some kind of violence. This is necessary in order to suppress the resistance of the masses who are experiencing real shock. Firstly, shock weakens their resistance, but also military violence. Pinochet in Chile, you know, a military coup. Then this was used in Argentina, in some other Latin American countries, then in Poland the same shock therapy was applied. Then this was applied in Russia. There was very clear violence in Russia, the coup d'etat of 1993, which was carried out by Yeltsin. That is, privatization took place amid the roar of tank guns, which democratically fired at parliament. Privatization is always associated not just with violation of laws and fraud, but with the use of force on the part of those who carry it out. And now, today, force was used in Ukraine. Applied. Has power been seized? Captured? Are there militant groups? It is possible to privatize the energy sector, says Yatsenyuk. Why didn't they carry out this privatization before? What was stopping you? The reaction of society got in the way. The reaction of part of the elite interfered. Now society is demoralized and has other problems. It no longer thinks about what will happen to the energy system of Ukraine, but what will happen specifically to the person to whom the fascists come and force him to do something or explain something. Here's how it works, why it's all done. But most importantly, I want to emphasize once again, you and I cannot name a single country where the Americans would invade under some pretext and where they would bring at least something good. Nothing. Even in Afghanistan, where the Soviet Union suffered significant losses, where there was a real war, despite the fact that it was called the fulfillment of an international duty, today Russian soldiers and Soviet soldiers are remembered with a kind word, not like the Americans. Because the Russians built roads and schools. This is inherent in our civilization. We don't consider Afghans beneath us if we come to them. We treat all people with respect. The main thing is that he treats us with respect too. But we don't consider them second-rate. This has always been inherent in the Russian Empire. That is, if the Russians came to the Caucasus, there was some kind of military conflict, but the Russians never considered the mountaineers to be second-class people. Vice versa. Look how much the Russians learned from the mountaineers. After all, the Caucasian War began at the very beginning of the 19th century, and ended in the middle. It lasted for almost half a century. Look, the guard of our kings already consists of Highlanders, separate formations. What did our Cossacks look like by the beginning of the 20th century and earlier? Popokos, mountain clothes, Circassian coat, gozari, dagger. That is, absolutely the clothes of a Highlander. And no one considered it shameful to take her into the Russian army. As a matter of fact, there is a photograph of the emperor in such clothes. If it's good, if it's right, if it's convenient, that's it, take it. This is the approach. You will never see a British general in Indian clothing. This simply cannot happen, because for him a Hindu is a second-class citizen. This is the difference. And our soldiers, the Soviet Union was generally a humanistic state, demonstrated the same attitude in Afghanistan. That is, on the one hand, we fought with those who shot at our soldiers. This is understandable. But on the other hand, we tried to improve the life of the Afghans, as we could improve it then. Americans don't do anything at all. They sit at their bases, they don't care what's going on there. They just give out money so they don't get shot at, and they give out money so they can grow drugs. Or their interests are limited to this. Their attitude is not like people. They are everywhere in some closed areas. That is, they have never brought anything good to where the Americans come, to where NATO troops come. I don't know, maybe you know something more, but I'm not familiar with such options. And the American military presence is constantly expanding. They always have to fight somewhere. The only thing we can say is that it is difficult for them to fight several wars at the same time, despite the fact that they have the largest military budget in the world, but this is an army that is used to fighting without contact. Losses are very sensitive for her. Therefore, if someone wants to drive the Americans out of their land, then they just need to kill the Americans. They then evacuate very quickly. If you remember the story when they invaded Somalia, 15 or 20 Americans were killed there. They evacuated very quickly, while filming Saddam Hussein's favorite film. Do you know which one? Black Hawk Down. He loved this film very much. I don't know why, but, nevertheless, this is a historical fact. He watched it many times. I read about it. Look how almost all of us went through the military conflict that the Americans staged in the past. We haven't talked about how they organized the conflict in Yugoslavia, so a few more words. Again, non-contact, bombings, rocket attacks, ships that are at sea, fighter bombers that sometimes do not even fly into Yugoslav airspace. That is, when approaching Yugoslavia, they fire missiles and leave. The rocket flies further on its own. Sometimes even the Yugoslav air defense was not able to shoot at these planes because they did not enter the airspace. Well, again, such demonstrative gestures. If you remember, one tomahawk hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing several people. There was a storm of indignation, of course, but then it calmed down. I mean the storm of indignation from China. But, nevertheless, you understand that if high-precision weapons end up at the Chinese embassy, then they were probably aiming at it. A little hello, as they say. Yes, and there is such a comic story associated with this Yugoslav tragedy, when one stealth plane was shot down, after which the Americans began to remove it from production, from service. And in Yugoslavia they wore badges saying, "Sorry, we didn't know he was invisible." Otherwise they wouldn't shoot you down out of respect for you. That is, the Americans thought that he was invisible, but he was not so invisible. And then he was shot down. Although these stealths are very expensive, they are, as you can see, useless, and are no longer available. They are so beautiful, somehow unusual, similar to alien ships, but, apparently, they have absolutely no combat meaning. Who organized the terrorist attacks in the United States on September 11, 2001? September 11, 2013. Today marks the 12th anniversary of a series of major terrorist attacks in the United States. There are several versions of their origin. The official version of the Washington regime says that several dozen bearded mujahideen, hiding in the caves of Afghanistan, developed and then carried out a complex jewelry operation to hijack planes and crash them into skyscrapers and the Pentagon building. The version is beautiful and understandable, if not for many inconsistencies in it. And if not for the laws of physics. So what happened on September 11, 2001? Let's remember. Before moving on to the details of that tragic day, I would like to say a few words about the state of the world economy. The difficulties in it did not begin yesterday, not in 2008. Like a fire in a pit field burning under the surface of the earth, the problems of a financially oriented economic system were already smoldering invisibly in the late 90s. And if for the general public the fire burst to the surface and became visible only recently, then for the world political elite the problem was visible a long time ago. I will say more, Gorbachev's betrayal saved the world economy from collapse. Inflation, which was double-digit in the US in the 70s, clearly showed that the patient had a fever. High temperature. If Mikhail Gorbachev had not destroyed the USSR, the Western economy would have fallen into today's tailspin in the late 80s. But this is by the way. The West always has the same recipe for solving problems, war. And the United States began preparing for war 12 years ago. What is needed for a global war? We need a global reason. Global provocation. And then September 11, 2001 happened. What was the idea? Organizations of Islamic radicals, which were nurtured by the states themselves during the Afghan war against the Soviet army, were planned as the spark for a new world conflict. After the large-scale terrorist attacks of 2001, Washington also knew exactly who was to blame. Just as today the United States knows for sure that Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons in Syria. For us, the key question is where it was planned to start the war. The answer is this: next to us, with our direct and widest participation. To recover the world economy, its owners were going to, once again, shed a lot of blood. Where? It doesn't matter where. The main thing is that there is a lot of it. That's why Russia-USSR found itself in the crosshairs of major military conflicts, because we have a lot of this blood. That's why the world behind the scenes loves to let it come to us. In 2001, the conflict in Chechnya was still in full swing, and there was unrest in Central Asia. What did Russia do? We have pushed instability beyond the borders of our country. And the war did not come to us. And its organizers had to start it all over again, preparing the Middle East as a springboard. The heyday of the career of Ramzan Kadyrov, who brought order to his native Chechnya with an iron hand, meant the decline of the careers of Mubarak and Muammar Gaddafi. This is not a paradox, this is world geopolitics. But now, with today's understanding of the situation, it is worth returning to the facts about the events of September 11, 2001. Here is a fragment of my book, Church Law Petroleum, 49. First, let's refresh our memory of the events of those days. 4 Boeing passenger planes were hijacked within an hour by 19 Arab terrorists armed with cardboard cutters. Suicide pilots took control of the planes and changed course towards New York and Washington. 2 Boeings were sent to the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. A fire started in the skyscrapers, causing their complete destruction. The 3rd Boeing crashed into the Pentagon. Passengers on the 4th plane fought the hijackers, causing the plane to crash in Pennsylvania. This is the generally accepted version of events. It took final shape within a few days after the disaster, becoming official. Now let's remember the most glaring inconsistencies of this version. Let's start with the most little-known ones. 52, on September 11, 2001, not 2, but 3 buildings collapsed in New York. The death of the 3rd skyscraper is carefully hushed up. The official government commission created on the events of September 11 did not include this fact in its report at all. There are 2 reasons for this. This building was the New York headquarters of the CIA, the Internal Revenue Service, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Operations Center and bunker of the New York City Emergency Management Authority. And most importantly, no flying object crashed into the 47-story skyscraper known as World Trade Center 7, located next to the Twin Towers. But for no apparent reason the building collapsed around 5 p.m. on September 11, 2001. And no one was hurt during its destruction. No one. At the same time, the house collapsed in shape in exactly the same way as the towers into which the Boeings crashed. 53. The designers of the destroyed building unanimously said that the possibility of an airplane hit was taken into account during construction and therefore could not lead to such consequences. The destruction of the towers was remarkably uniform, symmetrical and absolute. Huge skyscrapers folded neatly like a house of cards. They collapsed completely, turning into heaps of debris and clouds of dust, even without the remains of vertical steel columns. Houses fold so beautifully and correctly only with a directed explosion, used in the demolition of buildings that have expired. It does not require a lot of explosives, but they must be placed in the right places, in direct contact with structural elements, and detonated in a strictly synchronized sequence. 54. The plane crashed into the North Tower at 8:45 at a right angle and theoretically could have damaged the load-bearing steel supports of the building located in the center. At 9:03 a.m. a second strike was struck on the South Tower, but the collision occurred at an acute angle, which means that the aircraft debris should not have hit the supports. Meanwhile, despite the difference in damage, both towers collapsed absolutely symmetrically, the floors neatly collapsed, exactly as happens in cases of controlled demolition of high-rise buildings. Moreover, the less damaged South Tower fell first, at 9:59, and at 10:29, the North Tower, which received more serious damage, collapsed. And at 1700 hours the third one, into which no one crashed at all. 55. The official explanation for the collapse is that burning fuel melted the steel columns. The melting point of steel is 1538 degrees Celsius. Each of the towers contained 200,000 tons of steel. And all this mass was heated up and melted by fuel from the fuel tanks of one aircraft. After all, the amount of fuel that got into the towers was different. If the first plane flew inside, then part of the fuel of the second exploded into huge fireballs outside the building, which is clearly visible in the recordings and photographs. The towers are the same, the amount of steel in them is the same, the amount of fuel from the aircraft is different, the style of falling and destruction is the same. And the first building to fall is the one with less fuel in it. 56. The maximum temperature reached when burning clean aviation fuel is 825 degrees Celsius. Not only kerosene burned in the tower, but also everything that could burn. This should have caused the temperature to decrease, not increase. The possibility of fires is naturally taken into account when designing buildings. The maximum temperature for unprotected steel structures during test fires in the UK, Japan, USA and Australia was 360 degrees Celsius. Have terrorists really overturned the laws of physics and managed to melt steel at a temperature lower than necessary? Or did they inexplicably increase it to the required 1538 degrees Celsius? One of the American researchers of the September 11th mystery, J. McMichael, writes on this matter, the use of aviation fuel for melting steel is an amazing discovery, honestly. Metal processing specialists tinker with acetylene torches, oxygen in cylinders, electric arcs from generators, electric furnaces and other complex devices, but what did these ingenious terrorists use? Kerosene, worth 80 cents a gallon at market prices. 57. In a terrible fire, according to the official version, hundreds of thousands of tons of steel melted, hundreds of tons of concrete turned into dust. There was practically nothing left of the Boeing passengers, only charred fragments of bodies. Meanwhile, the passport of one of the hijackers who crashed into the plane's tower, Mohammed Atta, floated down intact and was found during the investigation. 58. There is still no answer to the question why the twin towers did not fall into pieces, but disintegrated, turning into dust. If a fire were the cause of the collapse of buildings, then the unevenness of damage and uneven combustion in different parts of the buildings would lead to the fact that the collapse would occur differently in each of the buildings. Then pieces of concrete and steel beams would be scattered over a large area, causing enormous damage and leading to numerous casualties among residents. That did not happen. There were no large debris, as is usually the case. 59. According to the official version, the third of the hijacked planes, American Airlines, aka Boeing 757 Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon. To cause maximum damage, the hijackers sent the plane along a horizontal trajectory. That is, they tried to drive into the building as if they were in a car and not on an airplane. The height of the Boeing 757 is 13 meters, the Pentagon is 24 meters. That is, the flight altitude of the airliner had to be literally several meters above the ground, which is an incredibly difficult maneuver. Why was it done? Much more damage could have been caused by simply crashing the plane down onto the building. At the same time, it's difficult to miss, the Pentagon occupies an area of 117,363 square meters. Terrorists choose the most difficult and less effective option. At the same time, flying a few meters above the ground, the plane tore down the wires stretched across the street. But somehow he managed to squeeze between the pillars, the distance between which is less than the wingspan of a Boeing 757. 60. Any person who has seen an airplane at least once in their life should understand that in the event of a horizontal collision with a building, the latter will inevitably be damaged by both the body and the wings. However, American investigators were not embarrassed by the fact that, judging by photographs from the crash site, the Boeing 757 carefully folded its wings before the collision, since there are no traces of the wings on the Pentagon building. No aircraft debris was found inside the Pentagon. According to the official version, all parts evaporated during the fire, as well as the steel supports of the World Trade Center towers. Meanwhile, in each of the plane crashes that humanity experienced, everything was never burned out without a trace. For example, when the Concorde near Paris crashed into a hotel immediately after takeoff, it was filled to capacity with kerosene, but there was more than enough debris. There was no debris left on the lawn in front of where the plane struck the building. But the wings should have broken off from the impact, and their fragments, along with heavy engines and part of the tail, would have been visible right at the scene of the disaster. But not a single screw is visible near the fire trucks, which could indicate that a plane crashed into the Pentagon. The wall into which, according to the official version, the plane crashed also did not stand for long. Although she simply could not survive in a collision with an airplane whose minimum speed was about 400 km/h. But the wall was preserved and stood rooted to the spot while firefighters extinguished the fire. It clearly showed the entrance hole, which only a 3-year-old child could attribute to the plane. And above the place where the huge plane crashed, several meters away, you can see entire windows, in which even the glass is not completely broken. Therefore, the outer wall of the Pentagon collapsed a couple of hours after the attack. 61. The destruction of the two twin towers was caused, according to the official version, by a fuel spill and a terrible fire. However, there are no traces of kerosene burning on the grass in front of the Pentagon. The lawn is quite green. Meanwhile, when the plane hit the second tower, a large fuel explosion occurred, creating fireballs outside the building. No one at the Pentagon had seen anything like this. And the destruction of this building itself is incomparably less catastrophic than what resulted from the same blow in New York. 62. The US government stated that the passengers and crew on board Flight 77 were identified through DNA evidence. After a fire that destroyed without a trace 100 tons of aircraft aluminum, the interior and exterior of the airliner. 63. Despite the miraculously preserved remnants of DNA, the black boxes of all the planes, according to the official version, burned down. Similar devices in almost all plane crashes remain intact and their records are deciphered and studied. 64. The fourth hijacked United Airlines flight, UA-93, crashes near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at 10:37 a.m., nearly 2 hours after it took off from the airport. According to the official version, the passengers of this plane began to fight the hijackers and did not allow them to carry out their plans, a strike on the White House. As a result of the struggle between terrorists and passengers, the plane crashed. However, some aircraft debris was found up to 8 miles from the crash site in residential areas. Many residents in the India Lake area reported flaming airplane debris falling from the sky. 65. There were more than 250 passengers on the 4 hijacked planes. They managed to make 13 calls to their family and friends directly from the plane. This is incredible. In 2001, the likelihood of a successful cell phone connection from a jet airliner flying at high speed and altitude was close to zero. Only in 2004 to 2005, a number of companies began developing equipment to ensure stable mobile communications in airliners, Boeings and Airbuses. The likelihood of getting through when the plane is descending is also extremely low. At lower altitudes, the jet leaves the same cell within 1 to 8 seconds. During this time, the phone manages to establish contact with it, but is already in the area of another cell. The conversation inevitably ends before it even begins. But if it is impossible to get through by phone from an airplane, how were the relatives of the victims able to identify their voice on the answering machine? There is an answer to this question too. Recently, a new type of fraud has appeared in Russia. Scammers call home and tell someone's relatives that he has been taken to the police for an accident, a fight, etc., and to get him out, they need money to hush up the unpleasant situation. So that the victim has no doubts, the phone is given to the victim, but just for a couple of seconds and he has time to say a few words. The point is that all victims of scammers hear the voices of their loved ones, who are in a completely different place, and obediently carry the money. It's not parodists or craftsmen who talk on the phone, swindlers call using a simple database of numbers and cannot know the timbre of the voice and the peculiarities of the conversation of a person unknown to them. And relatives hear what they want to hear. The investigation materials contain the text of one of the calls that took place. This Mark Bingham calls his mother and says, "Hello, Mom, it's me, Mark Bingham." 15. None of the callers from the hijacked planes mentioned Arab hijackers in any of the alleged telephone conversations. No one said a simple and important phrase in such conditions, "The Arabs hijacked our plane." 16. U.S. President George W. Bush not only rejected for a long time the invitation to speak to members of the commission investigating the events of September 11, but, having already agreed to the meeting, set his own conditions. He insisted on a time-limited conversation, 1 hour. The head of the United States agreed to give testimony only together with Vice President Dick Cheney. At the same time, there should be only 2 people from the commission, the chairman and his deputy. After difficult negotiations, the parties agreed that the conversation would take place in the White House and all 10 members of the commission would participate. The time limit has also been lifted. It would seem that the commission will be able to obtain comprehensive information from the president. However, not all so simple. To get Bush's approval for this conversation, we had to agree that there will be no video, audio recording, or even transcript of it. However, neither Bush nor Cheney had to take the oath. What U.S. leaders said to their congressmen is unknown to this day, although the conversation took place in April 2004. To understand the absurdity of this situation, imagine that a witness is called to court, but he agrees to speak only in the presence of another witness. For what? To hear his testimony and avoid discrepancies. The witness's testimony is then classified. And most importantly, no one obliged him to tell the truth. After all, the witness did not take an oath. There is an official version of the American government, and there are facts that refute it. We will obviously not know the truth soon. I'm concerned about one question. What happened to the passengers of the plane that allegedly attacked the Pentagon, if according to all calculations this attack was not carried out by a Boeing 757? Ukrainian victim. March 8, 2014. Speaking about American aggression in different states, it is very logical to touch on the topic of Ukraine, because this is another aggression, only carried out through a revolutionary path. Let's summarize, as they say, the dry residue. Ukraine had absolutely no plush president. We have no sympathy for him. Nevertheless, pensions and salaries were paid under him, and it was necessary to borrow $15 billion in order for everything to be fine. But there was stability, right? Nothing terrible happened in the month of August. The situation began to unravel due to the fact that Yanukovych did not sign the agreement on European occupation. Tragic events occurred, an armed rebellion, a seizure of power. It turned out that there was no money at all. Now what was needed was not 15 billion, but 35. There is an urgent need to privatize the energy sector, urgently reduce social benefits and increase tariffs. That is, that same shock therapy and privatization has begun, which is a consequence of the artificial creation of some problems. You can't just say out of the blue, let's lower your wages for all of you. Let's lower pensions for pensioners. Everyone will say, what are you talking about? Are you crazy, or what? How can a politician say that? He understands that no one will vote for him. There is no party that would go to elections with the slogan, we will lower your standard of living. If, against the background of this, there is another politician who says, we will raise your standard of living, because we are effective managers, of course, they will vote for the second one. Although, perhaps, there is no real chance to get out of the situation without reducing the standard of living. These are already features of human psychology, features of politics. Therefore, when we see that after certain events a reason begins to be created to lower living standards and make unpopular decisions, then we can understand that the purpose of this whole mess was these unpopular decisions. By and large, what has Ukraine achieved today? Instability. The state was reeling. Previously, there was no army in Ukraine, by and large. It was small, an army of 90,000 in total. This is very little. And then it mainly consists of internal troops. Now in Ukraine there is no more police, because the police have seen that for the honest performance of their duty they can also become criminals. The police, one of the pillars of the state, was cut down. About 100 people died, several hundred were maimed. Just to restore what was destroyed in Kiev requires $10 million. They are looking for them now. They address the sponsors of the Maidan and the Maidan participants themselves. For what? What have you achieved? So that elections take place 9 months earlier. Is it really that critical? Are 100 human lives really worth it if elections were held a year earlier? So that Yulia gets out of prison. 100 people had to die for her article to no longer be a criminal article. Agree, it's unclear why. Or maybe this whole story happened so that the oligarchs would become governors. It's also kind of strange. The Ukrainian citizen is not shown any visible advantage, so he is fed emotions. We are not slaves, we have become free, we are finally liberated. From what? From Yanukovych. So you would be free of him in a year. Then, in fact, you freed yourself from Yanukovych in 2004. They were completely freed in 3 rounds, and democratic elections were held. Freedom has completely won, that's it, there is no Yanukovych. Why did you choose him again 4 years later if you so wanted to get rid of him? It seems to me that we have every reason to think hard about what the opposition needed. It is possible that she needed to completely destabilize the economic and political situation and try to cause a war in Ukraine. Cause a war in Ukraine through the atrocities of the thugs, through these fascists, so they did not disarm them. Then the fascists began to behave absolutely defiantly. It would seem that they need to be pushed somewhere, like the devil, driven back into the snuff box, so that at least the display window is beautiful. Yes, we had excesses, but everything is in the past. There were fascists and they dissolved, there are no fascists, that's all. Only Democrats remained. No, these fascists come to the fore and make cooperation impossible for a number of people, including Russia as a state. But by its actions, Russia, which helped the legitimate center in Kiev, in my opinion, immediately began to rewrite this scenario. They hoped that we would not interfere, that chaos would begin in Ukraine, that we would begin, perhaps, some indecisive actions. Or we will turn out to be so stupid that we will engage in military clashes and begin the occupation of entire regions of Ukraine. This is what they need. They need a war, an occupation, to show that Russia is doing something. But Russia does nothing. The Russian fleet was stationed on the Black Sea, and it remains there. There were soldiers there, and they still are. Polite people appeared in Crimea, self-defense forces, who restored order, did not arrest anyone, did not kill anyone, did not rob anyone, did not do anything, they just stood there and that's all. And everything is quiet, calm. And we don't move further, because there is no legitimate government there that can call polite people. And polite people, as you know, do not go anywhere without an invitation. Polite people must be invited, then they can come. Therefore, the further development scenario depends on the residents of the regions of southeastern Ukraine. If they can organize and oust their governors, those appointed by these oligarchs, then polite people can help them too. And then the zone of order will expand. But it must expand without clashes. Because it is the war and the clash between the Ukrainian and Russian armies that is what the West needs. This is precisely why he simply sacrificed Ukraine. And since their script has been rewritten, now they will think, regroup and respond with something. I don't know what, I think some kind of provocation. There is already information that mercenaries from Blackwater are appearing there. They always carried out some kind of provocations, they don't know how to act differently. Question, is there a threat that the same provocations will begin in our constituent entities in Russia? And Starikov, would the Americans stop after carrying out a coup in Ukraine? Is Ukraine some kind of border beyond which they don't need anything? Obviously not. Ukraine is not the goal. Ukraine is a means. A means to achieve the next goal. The next goal is you and me. Our country is full of problems that you can play on, national, corruption, economic, whatever. It's all there. When will they do this? They always do this. There was a period of 2011 to 2012 when we managed to pump up these metrics. And then once, and everything was gone. Remember when they were going to do the March of Millions? And not just in terms of the amount of money they got for it, but the number of people they wanted to take out. But, thank God, they brought out much less. But what a swing it was. Do you understand what they wanted? Fill the squares of cities and thereby carry out a coup d'etat. If it turns out, bloodless, if it doesn't work, bloody. The main thing is to implement it, they don't care about human lives. Therefore, you and I can determine the milestone when they will do this. Nothing better than free direct democratic elections has yet been invented for a coup in the world. All coups d'etat or some of them occur against the backdrop of non-recognition of the election results. When are our elections to the State Duma? After all, these elections are taking place throughout the country, and the real power is being elected. Our people are structured in such a way that the higher the level of power, the more willingly they go to these elections. Almost everyone participates in the presidential elections, a little less in the Duma elections, and for some reason, at the municipal level, you can beat everyone there with sticks. Although it should be the other way around, this municipal level is closer to us, and accordingly, interest should be higher. But nevertheless this is not the case. Therefore, you and I must learn a lesson from what happened in Ukraine and prepare for 2016. It is there that there will be attempts to shake up the government, attempts to shake up the situation. Text typing, Ina by Kekina, Tatiana Dombrovska. Editing, Natalia Rizeva. Chapter 6. What should Russia do? The eternal Russian question, what to do? The answer to this is provided by the study of history. We need to do what has always been done when the people wanted to survive and develop. Defend your economic and geopolitical interest. For this we need a powerful tool, a strong army. And also a powerful ideology so that every soldier, worker and leader is convinced of the rightness of his country and his people. This is where the new century and new opportunities in transmitting information immediately pose a number of unique problems that our grandfathers did not have to solve. Control over the information space is necessary, otherwise our opponents can successfully repeat their perestroika trick, instill in our people the idea of the worthlessness and uselessness of their own geopolitical project. After all, we stepped into the world in 1991, naively thinking that we would be made equal to ourselves. The reality turned out to be sobering: degradation, population decline and lack of development prospects. The symbol of the West's desire for Russia is the trumpet. A pipe in every sense. As a way of existence of an economy focused exclusively on pumping resources there. And as a perspective for the people, their culture and traditions. The way to preserve for us is a clear awareness of our uniqueness. We are a separate multinational civilization. Our values are different, our mental code is different. For us, the main thing is fairness, not the number of varieties of sausage. We are different, and you clearly feel this when you come to the West. Trying to give up your own uniqueness is a road to nowhere. Instead, you need to actively protect your interest in all areas. Napoleon once rightly noted that those who do not want to feed their army will feed someone else's. He just forgot to clarify that this rule is universal. If you don't want to feed your own science, feed someone else's. Where have our scientists gone? If you don't feed your own education, you will feed someone else's. Where is it considered better to teach children today? And so on. We have one path and the answer to the question what to do. One is to build a powerful sovereign state that will protect the unique Russian civilization. How Russia can support the ruble, not the dollar. April 3, 2014. I took part in a roundtable on the topic Financial Sources of Economic Growth in Russia, What are the Reserves? It was held in the State Duma building. The event was attended by Chairman of the State Duma Sergei Naryshkin, Deputy Chairman of the Central Bank of Russia Ksenia Yudieva, State Duma deputies, experts, as well as leaders of a number of non-parliamentary parties. The media covered this event extremely sparingly. You could say that they almost didn't tell, despite the fact that the room was full of cameras and journalists. And the topic was extremely important. Deputy Chairman of the Central Bank Ksenia Yudieva actually reported on the work done to maintain the stability of the exchange rate of our national currency. I have no doubt that a lot has been done. In the same way, I am convinced that not everything has been done. The solution that I proposed at this roundtable is simply on the surface. In developed Western countries, you will not be able to open an account in another currency. In the USA, you will not be able to open an account in rubles or euros. In Europe, you will not be able to open a dollar account. All these are elements of supporting your currency. We still don't have this. Inside Russia, you can open an account in foreign currency. You can take out a foreign currency loan. In Europe, no one will give you a loan in dollars. In Russia, they do and actively offer it. This leads to the creation of demand not for rubles, but for dollars. All this ultimately leads to a weakening of our ruble and to greater dependence of our economy on the dollar. Let me explain once again so that there is no speculation. I am not calling for a ban on having currency in Russia. I am not calling for a ban on working it. The exchange of rubles for foreign currency in Russia should be free. But the Russian state should support not the dollar or the euro, but the ruble. And to do this, reduce the presence of foreign money in our financial system in every possible way. This is exactly how they operate in the United States and the Eurozone. So, what measures can be taken now? 66. Today the state guarantees deposits of the population in the amount of 700,000 rubles. Including foreign currency deposits in the amount of this ruble amount. It is not right. Russia can and should guarantee only ruble deposits, because only the ruble is our national currency. 67. This means that it is necessary to change the legislation and establish that from a certain date, preferably more than a year later, in the event of bankruptcy or revocation of a bank's license, the Deposit Insurance Agency will reimburse depositors only ruble deposits. Deposits in foreign currency will not be insured, but will not be prohibited. Any citizen of Russia can open such a deposit in euros or dollars, but then the risk of non-return of his money lies entirely with him. This is both fair and just. 68. Since recently the ruble has fallen in price against the currency, then, having assessed our financial capabilities, it makes sense to increase the amount of ruble deposits that will be guaranteed by the state from today's 700,000 to 900,000. Then the population will make sense by closing foreign currency deposits, exchange foreign money for rubles and open a deposit in rubles. This is just one of many measures we can use to make the ruble more stable and strong. This means making Russia's financial system more stable and strong. Today we see that our geopolitical partners are launching the attack against it if the leadership of our country pursues an independent foreign policy. I think that in the future it is necessary to gradually move away from lending in foreign currency to enterprises and individuals within Russia. How is a matter of technique, easily accomplished if desired. An example of this is the actions already taken by Sberbank, which suddenly stopped issuing loans in foreign currency, helping the population reduce currency risks 50. So the financial ice appears to have broken. And he set off quite actively. But, as for the maximum program, it is clear for the Great Fatherland Party and is indicated in our program. Priority of national legislation over international legislation. Restoring financial sovereignty, the right of the Russian government to sovereignly issue its currency. Deprivation of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation of independence from the state by changing legislation. The exclusive right of the state to manage natural resources. Retention of ownership of extracted resources in the hands of the state. Sale of resources on foreign and domestic markets for national currency, rubles. It is gratifying to see that the program of the Great Fatherland Party regarding the item, sale of resources on foreign and domestic markets for the national currency, rubles, is already beginning to be implemented. So, I bring to your attention the text of my speech at this round table, as well as the press's reaction to it. March 26, 2014, Moscow, State Duma. I would like to say that the current situation in the Russian economy is becoming increasingly dependent on the situation in politics, and not even on Russian, but Western politics. And it's hard not to agree with those experts who say that in today's ruble exchange rate there are approximately 3 to 3.5 rubles in the dollar exchange rate and 4 to 5, maybe 6 rubles in the euro exchange rate. This is purely economic pressure on Russia associated with the situation around Ukraine. That is, we are increasingly seeing that politics is actively interfering in the economy. And in this sense, it seems to me that an exclusively economic approach to the development of the Russian economy in the current international environment is unlikely to help achieve appropriate results without taking into account the complexity of the international situation. In this regard, of course, I would like to note the very surprising fact that in difficult international times, responsibility for the Russian economy, for the exchange rate of the ruble, for the development of our economy, as it happens, is placed on the fragile shoulders of women. The mega regulator today mostly has a female face. How does the mega regulator cope with today's functions? I would like to offer this analogy. Here is our ship of state, and there is an oarsman who is rowing out of this complex, stormy sea. Is the rower performing well today? Fine. Could he have done better? I think that the reserves are certainly not exhausted yet. Today many colleagues talked about the ruble exchange rate and deposits. I would like to pay attention to things that lie on the surface. Let's imagine a situation where a citizen of the European Union wanted to open an account in rubles or American dollars in their banks in Europe. I assure you that he would have had enormous difficulties. Most likely, he would not be able to do this. Let's imagine a citizen of the United States of America who, for whatever reason, decided to open an account in rubles, Swiss francs or euros. I assure you, this is almost impossible to do in the USA. The question arises, why is it completely free to open accounts in foreign currency in Russia? The answer is obvious, because Russia today is a more democratic country than the countries of the European Union or the United States. But in a situation where the ruble is under serious pressure today, I think that the central bank and the mega regulator should pay more attention to protecting our national currency. And it seems to me that this can be done in a very simple way. It's hard to disagree with Sergei Mikhailovich that bans are a very ineffective way to solve problems. Then let's act without prohibitions. After all, if today we place the risks of changes in the exchange rate, market conditions, and bank bankruptcy on those who open accounts for themselves in foreign currency, we will act quite fairly. At the same time, I would propose to increase the level of the guaranteed state account in rubles from 700,000, increasing it by a certain amount. By doing this, we will give a serious signal to our citizens. If you want to open accounts in foreign currency, the risk of losing this money lies entirely with you. On the other hand, if you want to open an account in rubles, please, the state stimulates all this and gives you the opportunity not to get 700,000 guaranteed back, but, for example, 900,000, or a million. But here you need to do the math and see what possibilities there are. Thus, we could largely stop the negative process of taking deposits from banks and transferring rubles into dollars. But these are, as they say, micromeasures that lie on the surface. If we return to the analogy with a rower in a stormy sea, then yes, our rower rows well, but any most professional world rowing champion will be much less effective than the most inferior Japanese motor that will be installed on this ship. Today we see that in the international situation that is emerging, there is an increasing need to create our own sovereign institutions. If earlier we only talked about creating a sovereign democracy, today the issue on the agenda is the creation of a national payment system. And in this sense, the sovereign financial system is the tool with which we will sail in this stormy sea much more effectively. That is, we are talking about creating a sovereign financial system, which alone will enable Russia to fully become a sovereign state. And in this sense, of course, the complete subordination of the central bank to the leadership of the state is necessary. If today the central bank is a kind of quasi-state structure that very often talks about its dependence, then I think that in order to solve the problems that Russia faces today, the central bank must be completely subordinate to the leadership of the state, and of course, it must be put on the agenda the question of the sovereign issue of our national currency without reference to the gold and foreign exchange reserves that we have today. Lessons from Ukraine, Tasks of Agitation and Propaganda. March 4, 2014. The current situation in Ukraine is a new challenge for Russia and at the same time a new window of opportunity. Any country, any state must have a reason for its existence. Depending on the decoding and on the extent to which this very meaning is recognized and felt by the citizens of the state, the weight of this state on the world stage largely depends. A state with meaning is a superpower. Already a superpower today or a potential one in the future, it doesn't matter. Since only this very meaning, which is otherwise called the civilization project, is that very force, that indispensable attribute, ingredient. For any country that has established itself as a superpower or aspires to this role in the foreseeable future. Another is simply a country in which citizens are united only by their nation, or only by the way they make a living, or by their past, or by the configuration of all this in one proportion or another. The raison d'être of the state, the civilizational project, is always a projection of the future. This is an aspiration for tomorrow. This is a claim to a breakthrough, to obtain an answer to the eternal question of any person on planet Earth: what is the meaning of his life? Why does he live, work, raise children, fight, gain wealth and then die? Countries that found answers to these questions and made these answers the mainstay of their own policies always became superpowers. The completeness of the answer to this question, the ability to adapt it to the urgent needs of their own citizens in a changing and unfriendly world, made them superpowers for a long time. But just until the meaning of their existence disappeared. On the other hand, fixating on yesterday and today, no state could ever form its own civilization project and grow to the level of a superpower. Such countries are always forced to adapt to those who live with meaning. Sometimes this works out well, sometimes not so well, but in any case, history is made by the superpowers, and the rest only reap the fruits of their efforts. Whether these fruits will be bitter or sweet depends on your luck with the historical era and the political balance of power in the struggle. There are countless examples of this. From ancient Rome and Byzantium to the USSR we all know. The rise and fall of all superpowers in human history is directly correlated with the rise and fall of their civilization projects. The meaning of existence of all the superpowers of mankind was the cement holding together different people, almost always of different nationalities. This meaning was the fuel that moved these societies and forced them to achieve results that influenced the lives of all their contemporaries without exception. As soon as the cement gave a crack and the fuel soured over time, the superpower faded into oblivion and gave way to others. When we, patriots, say that Russia is not a state in the usual sense of the word, but a separate civilization, we seem to a priori mean that our existence has a special meaning, separate from other countries. And we understand that the loss of this meaning will be another closure of Russia. Since there is no other meaning for the existence of different ethnically, religiously and historically peoples within the framework of one-state civilization, except for the aspiration to the future accepted by the majority, there is and cannot be. It follows that, without forgetting about their daily bread, their economy, weapons, social sphere and culture, it is vital for patriots to work on creating and formulating a new meaning. A new understanding of the eternal meaning of Russia as a state civilization, uniting all the peoples of the Russian world around the Russian people. The meaning of this existence can only be the same Russian meaning, the unification of peoples for the sake of peace. For centuries this unification took place, somewhere peacefully, and somewhere through war and coercion, but in any case, always and everywhere, the expansion of the Russian world to other peoples brought these peoples not destruction, genocide and poverty, but prosperity and development. The current situation in Ukraine is a unique chance for Russia to find itself as a superpower, as a state civilization that can win this confrontation not only with the power of its weapons, but with the clear and precise civilizational meaning of its actions. The bid for its own role in the world, which Russia has made by throwing the gauntlet in the face of the West, is, first of all, a bid for itself. As Russians are people of a different civilization of the Russian world, different from the West, which united around itself people of different nationalities, religions, and cultures. In today's world, where power rules, Russia can oppose equality and justice. In today's international politics, where lawlessness with the help of double standards is becoming a new paradigm of relations, Russia is obliged to provide an alternative to the law to everyone who suffers from this lawlessness and to everyone who does not agree to put up with this state of affairs. To rely in one's practical activities on equality and justice, to personify the law, this is the role of Russia, which corresponds to its historical mission. Our civilizational project, its meaning. This is Russia's natural role as a superpower, a departure from which could cost us all the loss of our beloved fatherland. But how can this be done in practice? When challenging the West, one must understand that it will not simply give up its ideological and civilizational primacy. We will not be able to win and establish our own role as a superpower, a country civilization, if we are on the defensive. You can't win by constantly defending. This means that our transition to attack is a matter of survival, the survival of us as a 1,000-year-old country. Thanks to the policy of the Putin years, through all the costs and shortcomings, we have finally reached the level where our military potential again poses a threat to our partners. The threat is so significant that open conflict is no longer possible. Conversations from the early 90s about the possible introduction of a limited contingent of peacekeepers into Russian territory have already turned into political fantasy. However, today's victories are not forged only with the sword. And not even that much. Russia today is not ready to wage information wars, and this field of geopolitical confrontations has now completely replaced the shelling of past years. Successful conduct of information wars, the ability to defend against information attacks and, most importantly, the ability to successfully attack yourself is the best way to demoralize the enemy and the best way to achieve your own victory. In a new round of tension, Russia, as in 1941, will have to learn these wars from the wheels, learn to win them. And we need to clearly understand that we will not have the opportunity to retake this exam if the study process is unsuccessful. This means we need control over the media. And a window of opportunity is opening for Russia to get it. This will protect the country from organizing a coup according to the Ukrainian scenario and will now allow us to break through the information blockade that may happen around the politics of our country. Information security, information policy of not only following the letter of the law and the truth of life, but also the opportunity to oppose one's point of view to lies and anti-Russian propaganda. All these are not only urgent tasks of the current moment, but also a question of the survival of Russia as a superpower. Non-resistance to evil through violence is a very beautiful theory. But, unfortunately, its effectiveness has not been confirmed by life if you are dealing with aggressive people, without honor and conscience. Dealing with issues of agitation, we cannot help but understand that our agitation will exist in the conditions of the dominance of the world media on a global scale. And as in the case of the army, whose ability to destroy any enemy will save us from military aggression like Yugoslavia. It's the same with the media, Only the ability of our media to neutralize false propaganda against us and conduct explanatory campaigns can save us from the complete loss of our civilizational exclusivity, and after it our statehood. Ukraine is the very case when we can win there, defend the law and rights of Russians, Ukrainians and people of other nationalities better with a pen than with a sword. All that remains is to realize this and start working in this direction. The Medvedev government should understand, the Russian Federation is not a business structure. March 29, 2014. In recent months, Russia has taken a serious step towards defending the interests of its citizens, native speakers of the Russian language and Russian culture outside the country. And this cannot but rejoice. However, in the euphoria of geopolitical victories, we must under no circumstances forget about internal problems and closely monitor current events. And then 2014, the year of success, the year of the reunification of Russia and Crimea, may become the year in which JSC Russian Railways carries out an unprecedented reduction in suburban passenger traffic. In January alone, commuter passenger companies, PPCs, cancelled 144 trains in 26 regions. Most trains were cancelled in Lipetsk, 31 trains, Kaliningrad, 29 trains, Novgorod, 20 trains, Voronezh, 13 trains, regions. The official reason for the mass cancellation of electric trains was the reorganization of the Russian Railways Holding Company. The essence of the reform was that Russian Railways had previously compensated for losses by transporting goods, which give the railway workers excess profits. But with the blessing of the government of the Russian Federation, headed by Prime Minister D.A. Medvedev, Russian Railways must get rid of the costly item, placing it on regional budgets. Suburban passenger companies have become a tool for transferring funding to the regions. As a result, 310 electric trains have already been cancelled in 2012 to 2013, and another 294 are planned for cancellation in 2014. If this trend continues, then in the near future the number of suburban electric trains will be reduced to 50% of the 2010 level, and instead of 3,000 daily train departures, there will be no more than 2,300 per day. However, the government headed by D.A. Medvedev is of little concern about this. Otherwise, suburban passenger companies would not be recommended to enter into contracts based only on the solvency of the regions. Moreover, the Russian government knows very well that regional budgets, in principle, cannot bear the burden of paying for suburban passenger transportation by rail in full. Let me explain. The federal law on the general principles of organization of legislative, representative, and executive bodies of state power of the subjects of the Russian Federation refers transport services to the population by rail in suburban traffic to the powers of regional authorities. Between carriers, suburban passenger companies, and authorized regional executive authorities, contracts for the organization of transport services for the population are annually concluded or extended. Regions set tariffs for passenger transportation in suburban services. As a rule, prices set by tariff regulatory authorities are significantly lower than cost and do not provide compensation for losses incurred in connection with transportation activities. At the same time, the law on railway transport directly states that losses during suburban transportation are compensated in full from the budgets of the corresponding levels. Less than one-third of regions can afford such luxury. The rest, apparently, are encouraged to explore working routes in the future. According to Russian Railways, at the end of 2013, only 5 regions were profitable for PPK, another 12 fully compensated for losses, and the rest underpaid suburban companies by 8 billion rubles. According to the head of Russian Railways, Vladimir Yakunin, taking into account previous years, as of January 1, 2014, the regions owed the railway monopolist 30 billion rubles. The measures taken forced a number of regions to correct the situation by increasing tariffs. In Beresia and the Amur region, train tickets doubled in price from January 1, 2014. Others get out as best they can. According to information provided by employees of Russian Railways, the Yaroslavl region has budgeted for 2014 only 19 million rubles, or 3% of the amount required for subsidies, and it is for this amount that the PPK will serve the subject. That is, instead of 100% of the transportation of passengers on electric trains, only 3% will be transported, the Kostroma region allocated only 2% of the required amount, 4.4 million out of 179 million rubles. The Oriol region, 2.5%, 5 million out of 200 million rubles. Chechnya, 9%, 4.8 million out of 155 million rubles. About 25 regions were forced not to sign contracts for the use of PPC services at all, since there were no guarantees of payment. A transport collapse is just around the corner. However, the Cabinet of Ministers of the Russian Federation consistently continues to pursue an anti-social policy, purposefully pushing the state to abandon social obligations to its citizens. The attempt to refuse maternity capital payments to families where the second and subsequent children were born, the introduction of social standards for the consumption of utilities, the reduction of suburban passenger transportation, all of this is the poisonous fruit of the antisocial experiments of the Medvedev government on its own people. The result of this policy causes absolutely justified indignation among residents of small towns and villages, for whom electric trains are the most reliable and affordable form of transport from autumn until the end of the spring tour. The cancellation of electric trains becomes a death sentence for many settlements. Redevelopment, in particular, of the fertile lands of the Voronezh, Rostov regions, Krasnodar, Stavropol territories will require huge investments in infrastructure. The lack of reliable transportation is a significant argument for the heads of young families who considered villages as a possible place of residence. The departure of transport systems from the outback leads to an acceleration of the outflow of the population to large cities, aggravating the problems of unemployment, affordable housing, and demography. Residents of large cities are little interested in this topic, but with the beginning of the Dacha season, which will be in full swing in a couple of weeks, gardeners, fishermen and tourists from cities will also be in for an unpleasant surprise. I am forced to state once again that the activities of the current Russian government are contrary to the constitution. The interests of monopolies are much more important for the Cabinet of Ministers than working in the interest of its own citizens. But it was at the expense of citizens' taxes that the railway infrastructure was created, which was immediately transferred into private hands. Today, in order to ensure the fabulous profits of Russian railways, part of which, by the way, ends up in offshore companies, the government is ready to relieve the state of all responsibility for social obligations to its people. Article 7 of the country's basic law, which states that Russia is a social state whose policy is aimed at creating conditions that ensure a decent life for people, is completely ignored. Medvedev's government should understand a simple thing: transferring vital services provided to the country's citizens to a commercial basis will lead to catastrophic consequences for the state. The Medvedev government should understand, the Russian Federation is not a business structure. Unlike open joint stock companies, closed joint stock companies, private entrepreneurs, individual entrepreneurs, etc., the state is not faced with the task of making a profit and enriching itself at the expense of the people. Russia must have one overriding goal: ensuring compliance with the principle of social justice and growth in the well-being of citizens in the economic and social life of Russia. If Russian officials working for the money of Russian taxpayers do not understand this, I recommend that they get acquainted with the air defense program and take into account the tasks and goals specified in it. And the first step is to cancel anti-social measures both in terms of establishing standards for energy consumption and on the issue of refusing to subsidize railway passenger transportation. Statement by the Presidium of the Air Defense Central Committee. April 22, 2014. The Presidium of the Air Defense Central Committee has repeatedly spoken out in favor of the abolition of social norms for the consumption of utilities. This is an unacceptable measure that violates the foundations of the Constitution of the Russian Federation and nullifies the principle of the social orientation of the Russian state. In August 2013, the chairman of the government of the Russian Federation D.A. Medvedev signed resolution number 614, according to which a social norm for electricity consumption is introduced in our country. 51. From September 1, 2013, in 6 pilot regions of the Russian Federation, electricity consumed by citizens was divided into 2 parts, the social norm and consumption above this norm. The range of energy rations is impressive. Social norms differ almost fourfold. Nizhny Novgorod, Vladimir, and Samara regions are all the central part of Russia with approximately the same standard of living and population. But for some reason, in the first two regions the social standard for electricity consumption is 50 kW/h, and in the Samara region, 150. Southern regions, Ora and Rostov-on-Don, the light norm is 190 and 96 kW/h, respectively. The volumes of energy rations vary twofold. Residents of Transbaikalia were allocated only 65 kW/h, and Samara residents, 150. Although, according to calculations by the Ministry of Energy and Housing and Communal Services of the Samara region, the basic value of the social norm for electricity consumption should be at least 178 kW/h per person per month. That is, almost all residents of the region paid at least 28 kW/h at increased tariffs. Where is the logic? Asks a simple citizen of Russia. The Great Fatherland Party answers, there is no logic. There is a great desire among the apologists of the market economy to remove from the state any responsibility for social obligations to its people. The air defense forces have repeatedly raised the issue of the unconstitutionality of the decisions of the Medvedev government. As a result, under pressure from public opinion, Prime Minister D.A. Medvedev was forced to postpone the introduction of social standards for the consumption of utilities for gas supply, water supply, and heating. The corresponding resolution was signed on April 21, 2014. Previously, the Cabinet of Ministers of the Russian Federation was forced to recognize the experiment to introduce social norms for electricity consumption as a failure. It would seem that you can breathe a sigh of relief. Not so. The government's explanations say that the introduction of social norms has only been postponed, and this does not mean forever due to the lack of metering devices among the population. Suddenly, government experts opened their eyes to the fact that only 57.5% of apartments and houses were equipped with individual cold and hot water meters, not to mention the absence of heat and gas meters. In addition, the decision of the government of the Russian Federation remains in force that by July 1, 2016, all regions, without exception, must decide on the size of the social norm for energy consumption and begin its widespread implementation. The Great Fatherland Party continues to maintain that improving people's living standards, which is the ultimate goal of any truly socially oriented state, can only be achieved by lowering tariffs, and not by secretly increasing them. Moreover, when God generously endowed Russia with all the resources necessary for this, the second way to improve people's lives is to freeze tariffs or increase them minimally, while increasing citizens' incomes by a much larger amount. Instead, the government begins to divide these tariffs into social and non-social in order to create a loophole for increasing tariffs, which will inevitably lead to a deterioration in the lives of the citizens of our country. The PVO considers the resolution of the government headed by D.A. Medvedev to be unconstitutional and raises the question of the suitability for their positions of employees of the Cabinet of Ministers of the Russian Federation who are unable to resolve the issue of energy efficiency and achieve transparency in tariff formation. Air defense reminds that antisocial policies towards one's people lead to social upheavals and explosions. And we do not want to allow them in a country that has the richest natural resources. In the social state of Russia, conditions must be created where any citizen of the country can live and develop with dignity, without being legally limited in how much light, water or heat he can consume. His honest work and earnings should provide him with comfortable conditions, life in which is not subject to rationing. A person must independently make decisions about what and how much he can afford without compromising his own budget. It is this position that is enshrined in the program of the Great Fatherland Party, which states that the principle of social justice and growth in the well-being of citizens should be decisive in the economic and social life of Russia. And if Medvedev's government is not able to follow it, then it needs to be changed. Presidium of the Central Committee of the All-Russian Political Party. Great Fatherland Party. Party Chairman, B. P. Obozny. Party Co-Chairs, I. S. Ashmanov, A. U. Kurinov, N. V. Starikov, V. E. Komayakov. Euro francs, the past that did not become the future. April 24, 2014, 1700 hours. How quickly time flies. My article, published just over a year ago, sounds even more relevant today. Today, after what happened in Ukraine and what else can happen there, thanks to the persistent and systematic actions of the West to split Russian civilization and the Russian world. Divide and push against each other. First they separated Ukraine, then they were going to separate the Urals and Siberia. It's time to restore the unity destroyed by the enemies of our motherland. Crimea as the beginning. We live in a single reality. What is real is what is around us. And therefore, very often we cannot assess what would have happened to the country if its leaders had made a different decision. Mikhail Gorbachev was in power for almost 6 years. Only 6 years old. And during this time, with his accomplices, he ruined the superpower. So fast. Vladimir Putin has led Russia for more than 12 years. What would happen to Russia if another person came to power? We can only guess. According to the scenario of our geopolitical partners, Russia was supposed to be dismembered. This process should have started with the invasion of Bosayev's gangs into Dagestan in the fall of 1999. The political and military liquidation of Russia was preceded by economic preparation. The future collapse was laid down economically. A little less than a year before the invasion of Dagestan, the GKO market suddenly collapsed and a default occurred in August 1998. And shortly before this, the discount rate of the Central Bank of Russia suddenly increased to 150% in the period from May 27, 1998 to June 4, 1998. Right before the crash, money became especially expensive. Accidentally? No. This was a deliberate preparation for default, the collapse of our economy. The meaning of this action is to create apathy and indifference of citizens to the death of their country. Why is she like this, where everything collapses and falls all the time? This scenario was rehearsed back in the USSR. Remember the deficit of the last years of perestroika. It was artificial. The cars were not unloaded, and products were not removed from the factories. Products were thrown into landfills and garbage dumps. In the summer of 1989, I was in a construction team in the city of Noyabsk. I personally saw fruits and vegetables in the trash heap. Quite tolerable quality, by the way. Against the background of their complete absence on the shelves of Noyabsk. And the USSR disappeared. Because the leadership of the USSR wanted it that way. But Russia survived. And it develops. Of course, we all want development to go faster. But it was Putin's actions in the fall of 1999, coupled with the heroic struggle of the Dagestani militias and our soldiers against the invading bandits, that preserved the integrity of our country. This must not be forgotten. It was Putin who removed the issue of the collapse of Russia from the agenda of Russian politics. Not thanking him for this is the height of ingratitude and disrespect. Why did I remember this today? Because during a trip to Ekaterinburg, my friends gave me a whole collection of Euro francs. You can view them at the link http://instorikovi.ru/blog/38870. It seems to me important that all Russian citizens see and remember this past, which did not become our future. The Euro Republic with its own currency. With its own bicameral parliament, copying the legislative body of a separate state, which accidentally ended up in the Urals with 2 chambers, when the region is quite enough with 1. There are many such accidents. By the way, the candidates for deputies in the Urals had very characteristic documents, where Republic was directly written. Here they are, the signs and ghosts of our past, our failed future. And we need to be careful so that this past never knocks on our doors again. I took the history of the appearance of the Euro francs from this resource, http://www.fox-notes.iu/sprevicos/fn_st0085_mercurin.htm. Pay attention to the mysterious debts associated with the release of Euro francs. Don't forget that subsequent attempts by the regional prosecutor's office to establish the sources of funds spent to pay for the order did not yield results. That is, no one has ever figured out where the funds came from to print the currency of the potential Euro Republic. Siberian separatist in Orange Studio. In Novosibirsk, I was invited to a program on TV channel 49 called Studio 49. It must be said that the design of the channel and the studio are made in orange tones. This is in terms of color. But in terms of essence, I'm sure it will be interesting to look at a living Siberian separatist who was sitting in the hall, and to whom I tried to clearly explain that it was time for him and his colleagues to quit this matter before it's too late, before they go to prison for trying to separate Siberia from Russia. In general, the program talked about geopolitics, Crimea, and the relationship between civilizations. 52. You saw the face of Siberian separatism in the program. This is Alexander Bekiev, who calls himself a regionalist, the founder of the National Cultural Autonomy of Siberians, Siberskia Volya. By the way, he is also a member of the public chamber of the Novosibirsk region. But this is what the separatists are actually trying to accomplish. Here is an open letter to the plenipotentiary representative of the Siberian Federal District of the Russian Federation, which calls for the creation of our own tax base in Siberia, regardless of the federal budget. Under the beautiful cover of increasing the role of the regions, the idea of decentralization of power is being pushed. You can admire how it ends in the end in Ukraine today. The government is completely helpless, the country is in chaos, the regions are worried. Here is a quote from the separatist letter to the plenipotentiary. Pay attention to their sympathies for separatism, which they do not even try to hide. Separatist sentiments are not an overseas bacillus deliberately planted in a healthy body, but a manifestation of one of the most radical forms of popular discontent. The use of repressive measures against them will give a short-term effect, but will not solve the problem at its roots, but rather will create new, even more numerous and radical sources of tension. As long as the population sees a violation of the principles of federalism on the part of the federal center itself, the alarming idea of secession will inevitably continue to gain explicit and implicit supporters. To preserve the integrity of the Russian Federation and ensure the conditions for the development of Siberia as a strategic macro-region, it is necessary today to begin creating a roadmap for the deconcentration of power, decentralization of powers and redistribution of the tax base in favor of the regions. Wikipedia, in the article Separatism in Russia, cites Alexander Bekiev as a representative of separatism in Siberia. In July 2013, representatives of the public chamber of the Novosibirsk region and the founders of the public association, Siberian National Cultural Autonomy, Alexander Bekiev and Yevgeny Mitrofenov, in an open letter to the presidential plenipotentiary envoy in Siberia Viktor Tolokonsky, asked him to initiate at the level of the country's top leadership the process of unifying the Siberian regions into a macro-region Siberia with increased tax, managerial and legislative powers of the subject of the federation. But Alexander Bekiev says that the Siberic nationality should exist. And who is he after that? Separatist or regionalist? And where is the place for this? I have spoken about this many times, the place for such things is in Siberia. Let them work on construction sites of the national economy, in the fresh air, with full state support. And another question. The Air Defense Forces, together with Yevgeny Fedorov, introduced a bill on the fight against separatists to the State Duma, after which deputies from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation introduced their own, much softer project. The president already signed this law on December 13, 2013. It comes into force on May 9, 2014. So I told the separatist Bekiev that it was time to stop it, with the best intentions. Will he just listen? This is Russia, baby. April 4, 2014. How did it happen that Russia, already deprived of political power in the 90s, with stolen, privatized property, without an army or a population organized and united by a common goal, was able to return to the world stage? And she was able to get her own voice again, albeit not the same as before, but already a significant voice. At the same time, having regained many of the lost state functions, while raising the standard of living of its citizens and a new, albeit timid, but confidence in the future. This is a real Russian spring. And Russia owes this to Vladimir Putin. On April 69, 2014, a presentation of the series of publications, Vladimir Putin in the Mirror of the Izbos Club, took place in Moscow. As a permanent member of the Izbos Club, I published material on this topic on IC Resources. I present to your attention my article, 53. The worst thing for a politician is indifference. When no one is interested in business, when no one is interested in the figure. In this sense, Russian President Vladimir Putin does not need to worry. He evokes respect from the bulk of Russian voters and bitter rejection from the non-systemic opposition, which goes to the US Embassy for instructions. 1. In 1992, the book The End of History and the Last Man by the American philosopher and political scientist, and by coincidental coincidence, an employee of the US State Department, Francis Fukuyama, was published, in which the author argued that victory in the world of Western-style liberal democracy is the end point of sociocultural evolution humanity, which, in his opinion, means the formation of the final form of government. Fukuyama argued that the mere spread of such a form of government does not mean the end of historical events, but only marks the end of the era of ideological confrontations, revolutions, and global wars, and with it the end of art and philosophy. This work received wide resonance in the Western press and in the scientific community. The roar of the fall of the Soviet Union caused an urgent need to comprehend the new reality, which then, in 1992, was just beginning to emerge in outline against the background of the settling ashes remaining from the destroyed second center of power in the world, which was the USSR. It is quite justified that the surprise for the United States itself of such a geopolitical situation, when they were left alone with the entire planet, without their usual restraining confrontation with an equal partner, caused them a kind of dizziness with success, which can now be called this work Fukuyama. The then resounding success of this book, which no one in the West likes to quote today, its apparent paradox, its demand by the most diverse layers of Western society, is nothing more than a Freudian slip. When someone, a person, a country, or a civilization, declares itself out loud and understands itself as the perfect result of the development of all humanity, then, as they say, expect trouble. After all, what does it mean to feel like an ideal, above which no one else can jump? This means the right to judge others, make decisions for them and force them to make them through persuasion or force. Indeed, it would be strange to allow another person or another country to participate on equal terms in the development, adoption and implementation of decisions concerning two parties, if the opposite party is less developed, civilized and capable. Anyone who is less capable, what else can you call a person, country or civilization that has not yet reached a certain obligatory level of development, cannot equally bear responsibility precisely because of his lesser or insufficient legal capacity. Life confirms this rule many times over. We make decisions for our children, taking into account, as far as we think possible, their opinion until they reach adulthood. That is, until they become as capable as ourselves. Large and powerful countries always make decisions based on their own interests, first of all, and only secondarily, based on the interest of weaker and smaller neighbors. Equality is equal power, equal responsibility, and equal recognition. Anything else without these three pillars has no right to be called equality. Sometimes it happens that equality is possible without equivalence, if the stronger party, based on its moral and civilizational principles, allows both equal responsibility and equal recognition in relations. The role of strength in this case is played by an internal attitude towards self-limitation of strength on the part of the stronger, but at the same time morally developed. But if you, your loved one, recognize yourself as a standard, as the highest point of development, then you are a priori unable to give your partner equality if this partner is not equal to you, or if this is not tactically beneficial to you for something at some point. Stage. It should be noted, however, that any civilization in the history of mankind has always felt better in relation to another with whom it came into contact. Otherwise, the people and nations that make it up would have no sense or incentive to create it. It would be easier to merge into another. From this point of view, it is not surprising that Western civilization, like any other, including Russian civilization, considers itself better in relation to others. But it is necessary to note the following, very, in my opinion, important point: to be better in one's sense of self does not mean to actually be the crown of creation, the standard and the end of history. For example, Russian civilization, while feeling itself to be the most multifacetedly developed, firstly, does not feel like the end point of development for all of humanity, and secondly, it doesn't even feel like one for itself. Living an endless period for your own self-development and self-improvement. This is something that Western civilization has never had. Within themselves, its apologists always felt themselves to be the center of the universe and an example for all races and peoples. Even in very recent times, by historical standards, when they denied personal hygiene, ate with their hands and threw their own slops out of the window next to the house. In general, the experience of European history itself teaches us that as soon as any of the countries or civilizations began to conceptualize itself philosophically, and after that politically and geopolitically, as the crown of history, as the only possible of all existing states for a real person. So immediately, from the point of view of the historical process, and not human life, came great blood, chaos and devastation. Ancient Rome in the ancient world. Holy Inquisition in the Middle Ages. The Third Reich in modern history. These are the most obvious examples of the political implementation of the philosophical paradigm of the end of history and the victory of the civilization of Rome, the power of the Holy See or the Aryan spirit and blood. Further, the one who called himself the crown of development of human civilization was forced to fight with those who did not accept the alien civilizational choice imposed on them. When exactly he will begin to fight barbarians, heretics or subhumans is a matter of time, but not a matter of choice. From this point of view, the current struggle of the West against totalitarian, insufficiently democratic or simply illiberal regimes, the creation of a new axis of evil is an absolutely familiar European choice. We can say that as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the West immediately returned to its usual state of its own exclusivity. This time, his exceptionalism was expressed in the liberal democratic paradigm, which at first glance is humane and peace-loving. But don't let anyone be fooled by another change of outfit. This is how the philosophical and political social thought of Western society is structured, that as soon as equivalence with them disappears, or benefit for them as a temporary replacement for equivalence, no one can ever achieve any equal responsibility and equal recognition, including us. This is neither bad nor good. This is a fact proven over centuries. This must be taken into account when building your own relations with the West. In some ways, I personally think this is somewhere even more good than bad. Good for its multi-thousand-year predictability. In general, Western countries and Western civilization can be pleasant and useful partners. Under one condition, when you have a big club or a powerful army. If you, without compromising on external polish, work to maintain equality with them, then after that you can receive the benefits and results that you need from communicating with Western partners. With such initial data in 1992, Russia, as the largest, richest and potentially powerful part of the USSR, was left alone with Western countries. Deprived of a measure of equivalence with them, she was immediately faced with a lack of equal recognition and equal responsibility. There was nothing surprising in this, although at the very beginning, the majority of citizens then and a significant part still have the misconception that the West does not need anything from us or that the West will help us. But geopolitics dictates its own laws. And they in no way correlate with the dreams and delusions of Western-oriented fellow citizens. The West needs a lot from us. And as it should be. And certainly the last one in this world who will actually help us in difficult times will be the West. 2. If we do not dwell on the long history of the formation of capitalism in Western Europe and its genesis, but immediately voice the conclusion from this history, then we can state that by the beginning of the 20th century, industrial capital gave way to financial capital. We will now leave the question of how much of this was due to objective factors and how much by subjective ones. We are interested in Russia after the USSR, which collided with the West. Our Western partners, although, unlike the USSR, reached the finish line in this peaceful race of different social systems, did so with all their might. In medical parlance, the condition of the Western world was stable and grave. Suffice it to say that the United States of America, at the time of the beginning of perestroika in the USSR, which, in essence, was the beginning of Gorbachev's controlled demolition of Soviet statehood, had an inflation rate in double digits. And the number of unemployed people was only slightly lower than during the Great Depression. Again, as in the 15th century, at the beginning of the era of great geographical discoveries, it was necessary to rob someone in order to live happily ever after. but the West would not be the West if it simply robbed. He almost always needs a beautiful explanation, a tale of robbery. This is an obligatory part of the European mentality, part of the European self-awareness. A European cannot just come, kill and rob. He was used to fulfilling a mission by killing and robbing. A pleasant addition to which is military looted booty. The European carried the Catholic word of Christ with fire and sword at different times, from Mexico City to Manila and the Pskov region. A little later he simply carried an abstract civilization. A little later, we fought against the prison of nations, and then, through the hands of the National Socialists, against the Judeo-Bolsheviks. Then he fought totalitarianism. Now he is again trying to fight the authoritarian regime for fair elections. In general, the white man's burden for a European is what for us, for Russians, a beloved woman is in our hands, she cannot bear her own burden. And this burden always had significant compensation in the form of property stolen from the civilized and saved. The repetition of the European method of survival by robbery is amazing. The stages are the same. Stage 1, choosing a goal. The goal must meet several criteria. It must possess what is vitally necessary for the West. Relatively speaking, it could be gold, as in the Middle Ages, or oil and gas today. These are human resources, fertile soil, the whole range of product of primary extraction and processing of resources, from flax and hemp in the past, to crude oil and round timber today. When choosing a goal, the West professes one principle: what I need is already mine. Russia, which after the USSR lost its equality, and after its equal responsibility and equal recognition, had to deal with the West, which saw in it its next goal of interest to it. Stage 2, purposeful implementation of the policy of chaos. He needs chaos in the territory of interest to the West for the sole purpose of bringing a civilized society, and with it the institutions of its statehood, to a state of shock. This is the only state in which a civilized object can be maximally controllable. In another state, he will not be ready to act against his own interest in favor of the interest of the civilizing one. Only shock, as a result of chaos, can force the blacks to work for food on the plantations. Indians, to give gold, maize, tobacco and spices for the right to live. Hindus, to exist in poverty and civil strife for the sake of the income of the East India Company. And for the Russians, to destroy their own foundation and base in the form of statehood and industry in exchange for another tranche of credit from the IMF and another praise for the successful movement towards democracy. Stage 3, a policy to maintain a status quo beneficial to the West. These are the actions of the colonial authorities aimed at suppressing the sprouts of any national patriotic self-awareness, the only one that can challenge the civilizers from the civilized. It is especially worth noting that the West always, and especially at the second and third stages, largely relies on the forces of the internal elite of the civilized people by directly bribing it and including it in the system of enforced civilization. From this point of view, Russia after the USSR in the 90s was no different from any civilized territory to which the West turned its attention. Neither in terms of the level of damage to national wealth in its favor, nor in terms of the level of direct and indirect human losses, which are always measured in millions of lives. Even in terms of the form of bribery, corruption and inclusion of representatives of the local native elite in the system of Western values, nothing new was proposed in the 20th century. Poverty and debt came equally to the American Indians, to the Indians, and to Russian cities. And in the same way, equally involved in maintaining this order of things, participating in the robbery and killing of their own peoples in favor of the civilizers, representatives of Indian leaders, Indian Maharajas and the Russian oligarchy and corrupt officials were bribed, taught their children in the West, and kept their loot there its own people have savings. The policy of chaos and shock allowed the West to achieve amazing results at all times. The conquistadors in the Middle Ages, who destroyed the great civilizations of America with fire and sword, from this point of view are no different from the Chicago Boys or the European commissioners of today. 3. To understand the irrationality of what happened to us in the 2000s under Putin, we can imagine the Aztec Empire from the beginning of the conquest of America. The Spaniards, the shock, the elite who sold themselves to the conquistadors, and the dismantling of the Aztec state in full swing. And then everything changes. It is as if Montezuma, before his death, would have handed over the reins of power to his successor, who would have bought the elite from the Spaniards. On the grounds that, I pay the same amount, but my executioner and I are closer than the Spaniards. Unscrupulous robbery would be exchanged for profitable trade, as a result of which the standard of living of the Aztecs would be raised significantly higher than in the time of Montezuma. Then, for example, in August 1508, he would have defeated the army of a neighboring tribe, armed by the Spaniards and trained according to Spanish standards. He would begin to gather the Indian tribes scattered by the Spaniards around himself and begin a program to rearm the Aztec army. Adopting a program that would, by 1518, raise the Aztec army to a level where the Spanish could no longer force the Aztecs to their knees. Such a scenario would now be perceived by us as historical fiction. But with all the strained conventionality of such an example, we cannot help but note that something similar happened in Russia at the turn of the 90s and zeros. Russia in the 90s was already tightly entangled by civilizers. The real Montezuma greeted the Spaniards with the words, "We have been waiting for you, this is your home." Our domestic Montezuma bien Yeltsin met the civilizers in approximately the same way, if not in words, then in deeds. But only the real Montezuma did not have a successor, but Boris Nikolaevich had one. As a result, the history of Russia made, in small steps over 15 years, the same sharp turn as in the hypothetical example I described in the genre of historical fiction from the hypothetical history of the Aztec Empire. In light of which, again, like 15 years ago, the question remains fully relevant, to which many are still looking for their answer: who is Mr. Putin? In my opinion, it would be a mistake to look for it in ideological, economic, or political science terms. When we operate with them, we become like the French from Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. He described the Patriotic War of 1812 with the following allegory: the Frenchman, effectively fencing against the Russian enemy in the right position, reached Moscow. And he was quite surprised when the Russian, throwing away his sword, picked up a club and began to hammer it on the French crown until he drove the Frenchman out of his own country. With this example, Tolstoy meant a situation where the Russians violated, as the French believed, the then existing rules of war. All these dispositions, pitched battles, flank attacks and other crunches of French bread in white gloves. When the main danger for the French army became an angry Russian man with a shaft, not trained in the courtly manners of knightly war, but simply silently destroying any Frenchman with a gun without any gallantry there. When we try to answer the question, who is Mr. Putin, and apply our own ideological, economic, or political views, then we, like Tolstoy's hypothetical Frenchman, accept the correct position of a fencer and are ready to offense any opponent in it. The problem is that our current opponents from Western civilization are not in this correct fencing position. They don't care how skillful we are in our views. They do not have a sword and rules, but only the club of globalism and the shaft of their own exclusivity. And they thresh this club, mixed with shafts, against the crown of the whole world with enviable and regular consistency. Failure to understand this leads to a constant break in one's own ideological, economic and political science templates with reality, in which Mr. Putin is forced to discard courtly manners, which tell such and such a politician, with such and such political views, to behave this way in such and such a matter, and in such and such a way. And, having rejected them, he is forced, against the club of globalism and the shaft of his own exclusivity, to pick up the mace of state sovereignty, and somewhere to thrash the civilizers on the crown, and somewhere to run away and sit quietly in the bushes, in ambush, taking a breath. Since there is no valor in death if it does not bring victory closer. From this point of view, Mr. Putin is a man function. A computer antivirus program, if you will. The cleaner for the careerist, opportunist and Trotskyist, whose alliance with the civilizers made it possible to collapse the USSR with the beginning of perestroika. And what its function is, what its parameters are, and what the danger of the situation is if today's function does not continue and develop tomorrow, I will tell you in the next part. 4. The Friedman School of Neoliberalism teaches how to better and more correctly move away the state from performing its own functions. Reduce taxes, complete freedom of trade, privatization of not only the most delicious pieces of state property, but also part of state functions, education, medicine, pensions, maintaining law and order, etc. A general reduction in spending on the social sphere, a weakening of government control in general. Why do they need this, you ask? And everything is for the financial well-being of corporations. To transform the power of money into political power. Ideally, in the future, there will be people and nations without states at all and without laws, but driven only by economic, financial expediency. The world in which states existed that relied on their own citizens, including those who were engaged in business, was irrevocably, as it seemed to many, gone with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has been replaced by a world in which corporations rely on states to pursue their purely corporate goals. And its own citizens are already turning into enemies if they do not meet the goal of the corporation, expressed in improving financial reporting. Don't believe me? Here is a quote from Milton Friedman related to the issue of private and public schools in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, to defend our freedom from both foreign enemies and our citizens, to preserve law and order, to promote private contracting and competition in the marketplace. And this is not said about citizens of Russia, Iraq, Yugoslavia, or Libya. This is said about American voters, both from foreign enemies and from our citizens. Today, TNCs, which exist according to the rules of globalism within the framework of the theory of neoliberalism, need only their armies and police from all states of the world in order to effectively protect corporate business. As a result of such wise neoliberal policies in the same New Orleans that Friedman so openly spoke about, before Hurricane Katrina there were 123 public schools and 7 private ones. After the restoration of the city, there were 4 public and 31 private schools, data for 2006. We fully tested these theories on ourselves in Russia in the 90s. Stage 1, Creating Chaos, 1985 to 1991. Stage 2, Bringing society to a state of shock, in which all the usual social ties are severed, the usual social environment collapses, and efficient state institutions of power are dismantled, 1991 to 1993. Stage 3, when the state of chaos reaches its climax, when citizens do not think about anything other than their own physiological survival, and the state is completely demoralized. At this time, there is a sharp increase in the repressive component of the state, shooting down the White House with tanks, which is necessary to force radical reforms. The purpose of which is the redistribution of former state property and state functions attractive to corporate business, 1993 to 1999. From the point of view of the neoliberals, Russia was already quite a corporate state in 1999, when Putin took the helm of the country. All that was left to do was to transfer into the hands of transnational companies everything that had been privatized during the previous period. The issue of ownership is extremely important. The Khodorkovskys and Nevslins, having done their job and worked as its chairman for the most dangerous period of time, having done all the dirty work, had to transfer, sell, the privatized assets into the hands of the organizers of chaos. That is, large international monopolies. The consolidation of the same UCOS to the size of the largest oil-producing corporation in the world and its preparation for sale played the role of a starting gun in this process. And here the organizers, the political and financial sponsors of the neoliberal revolution in Russia, the USSR, after a 7 and a jack, fell not the ace they expected, but that same fatal Russian Queen of Spades. Putin's emergence at the heights of power could not have happened on its own as a result of a random combination of circumstances. Issues of property and power require a reverent and thoughtful attitude. Making decisions at random is not accepted here. Such relaxed courtiness in matters of property and power, hope for chance or that it just happens somehow, usually lead to enchanting defeat and the loss of everything acquired. Our geopolitical partners have never suffered from powerful romanticism, demonstrating from century to century the most cynical pragmatism. Other behavior means political death, which, in most cases, is followed by physical death. The times when they could still afford romance in politics ended with the mythical King Arthur or, in extreme cases, with Richard the Lionheart. So how did it happen that after so much luck they ended up with a queen instead of an ace? How did it happen that a country, deprived of political power, with stolen, privatized property, without an army, or a population organized and united by a common goal, was able to return to the world stage. It was able to survive, was able to get its own voice again, albeit not the same as before, but already a significant voice, while regaining many of the lost state functions, while raising the standard of living of its citizens and a new, albeit timid, but confidence in the future day. If one of them ever asked me this question, I would, with my arm around the shoulder of the questioner, Bush, Thatcher, Friedman, Rothschild, Rockefeller, Clinton, and his wife, as well as all the other Sarkozys, would answer, looking straight into his eyes, with a phrase they understood from their own films. And I wouldn't be joking at all. Russia is a separate civilization living according to its own laws of development. This is the first. And second, Russia is the only world civilization that has never been conquered by anyone to the end. That is precisely why it was in Russia that, as B.N. Yeltsin would say, such a squiggle happened. We often, without thinking about why this is so, say that we have a unique ability to digest other cultures within ourselves and, taking something from the outside into the bosom of our own civilization, transform it in such a way that the output received is no longer enough looks like something that was introduced to us from the outside. We were able to preserve such civilizational immunity precisely because Russian statehood has existed without interruption for more than 1,000 years. Because our statehood, which arose at the junction of the West and the East, absorbed elements of both, uniting both Western and Eastern peoples and subcultures, was able to develop a special civilizational feature, its own good, bad system. Their own special method of survival, synthesizing Eastern collectivism with Western individualism. Russia has managed to combine the incompatible, a society that exists as a collective of individualists welded together by a common goal. Hence, by the way, our weakness, not having a common goal idea, we fall apart into individualists without a king in our heads. But this is where our strength comes from, remaining individualists, aware of our destiny to act with individual, private initiative, but being united by a common goal, unconsciously giving out to the mountain the cumulative effect of our own victories. This is not a Western system of knights, where everyone is for himself. And not the Eastern horde, where everyone is just a cog and acts according to the rules of the swarm. This is Russia for you, baby. Here the unconscious goal, felt by the majority, forces everyone, without even thinking, to do what they should. Individually and independently, without special orders. And the sum of these deeds and thought forces individuals to strain their strength for the sake of a collective goal. Because it's necessary and it's right. Because that's how we feel. Even if sometimes we cannot really explain why this is correct and not that. In practice, this means that our geopolitical partners know exactly the civilizational codes and value systems of their own peoples and the peoples they conquered. Marketing and advertising technologies, originally invented to promote goods, used today for the purpose of political manipulation to promote individual politicians or ideas, on our Russian soil give periodic failures, leading partners to failure. Centuries of struggle with us gave them knowledge about our military secret, about the need within the framework of our civilization for a common goal idea, which alone can weld our society into a single whole and make it invincibly stable. This knowledge allowed them to catch us twice during the 20th century, in 1917 and 1991, at a time when there was an acute shortage of a common goal idea. But what to do next with the seemingly already conquered people? They do not possess this knowledge. Hence their defeats after victories, the USSR in the place of the destroyed empire and the new Russia, straightening its shoulders after the collapse of the USSR. This is their problem. We are different. And the activity of our partners is connected not only with selfish interest, not only with the fact that we are rich in natural resources. To a large extent, their centuries-old and manic need to come to us, either with a sword or with conversations, is due to the fact that we do not fit into their heads. The very fact of our successful existence is a challenge to the entire Western development paradigm. We profess a different religion, we profess different values, and we are rich. For ordinary European political thought, this is enough to recognize us as natives, dangerous and subject to plunder and subjugation. But what especially irritates them is that for the most part we look like them. that is, we are white. If we, the peoples of Russia, united by a common Russian civilization, were different from them, like blacks, Chinese or Aztecs, with a different appearance and culture, then the fight with us would be just business and nothing personal. But we challenge their culture and their civilization, showing a different path of development from them. And unconsciously this causes fear and mistrust. And in politics, this leads to the fact that over the last 10 centuries we have repelled most of the wars and invasions from them, from the civilized Europeans. For the last 300 years, almost all wars have been wars with Europe. And even rare inclusions here, against the general background, of Russian-Turkish wars or with Persia-Japan, although these are wars in the East, but with money and with the direct support of Western countries. But let's return to Russia at the very beginning of Putin's reign. In 1999, one could say about our country, the client has matured. All property from the state passed into the hands of the Its chairman. There is no army as such. By the beginning of the second campaign in Chechnya, there were about 30,000 combat-ready units, recruited from all over the world. There is no state. The 1998 crisis made the system of state obligations a completely absent institution. The people were busy with their own survival. No idea. The desire to secede from Russia, following the example of the republics of the USSR, gained momentum and took complete forms in the national republics. Their plan was simple and tested many times. A blow from outside. The blocking of oil and gas transportation routes to the west, the intervention of NATO countries under the pretext of ensuring the uninterrupted supply of energy resources to Europe. Plus the threat of the uncontrolled proliferation of nuclear weapons. Remember the 3 combat-ready divisions also engaged in the war in the Caucasus. All this was an excellent reason, in connection with instability, to sell everything privatized and stolen. And on top of this is the collapse of the country. It is clearly easier to manage several small states from the outside than one large one. This is already the experience of the collapse of the USSR. And so, in fulfillment of this scenario, the gangs of Kotob and Bosayev, the prototype of today's gangs in Syria, partly including the local population, propagandized and deceived, partly mercenaries from all over the world, moved to Dagestan. I have already said that Putin's rise to power could not have happened on its own, by accident. Naturally, he was selected taking into account this development of events, and it is natural that everything was taken into account. An unknown official from the security forces was an ideal candidate. Lack of political weight, mass of supporters, political force on which he could rely, without state and material resources. At the same time, he is a security official. He could be used in the dark for the development of events predicted by the West. Force experience could guarantee his inclusion in the problem of the predicted demolition of Russian statehood, if something suddenly went wrong. And his microscopic weight as a politician ensured that Putin could be manipulated like a puppet, since there is no man in the field. At the same time, Putin could play the role of a scapegoat in the destruction of the state, just as Kiriyenko played the same role in the destruction of the economy a year before. But this is Russia. What did the Chinese do when they lost the Opium Wars and fell into enslaving dependence on Western countries? It was said that they lost, which means they lost. They let go of their pigtails as a sign of defeat, and wore them until the West itself weakened and released its grip. What did the Germans do when they signed the Act of Surrender? They went to the Soviet troops for stew and porridge, and to the United States for the Marshall Plan, and are still humbly repenting for that war. What did the peoples of Russia do in 1999? Our Russian code worked. Putin's famous phrase, to soak in the toilet, the passion and pain with which he said this to the whole country, awakened the general unconscious among the people. Sneakers are good, and used foreign cars instead of Zigulis are also good. Having your own shop is generally great, freedom of speech is wonderful, but the general unconscious was different. It lay in the plain of, fuck you all, we're tired of it worse than a bitter radish. For 1,000 years we haven't known defeats in wars on our land, and now we want to win and be proud. This, wetting ourselves in the toilet, awakening the general unconscious expectation of the absolute majority, gave a common goal and confidence and a common thirst for victory. Any victories? From the capture of Gudams and Grozny to victories in hockey. From the murder of militant leaders personally involved in the death and suffering of our citizens, to the next high-profile contract of Gazprom and the third place of the country's national team at the European Football Championship. The country, accustomed to winning, and the people, who recognized themselves as a victorious people, wanted victories as greedily as a traveler thirsts for water in the desert. And they were just as indiscriminate in the taste and meaning of these victories. Did they push the militants back? Great. Berezovsky escaped, and NTV was taken away from Guzinski. Great, they laughed at us. It's time to know the honor. Has the price of oil increased by $0.50? Amazing. Even if this makes us neither hot nor cold, but at least $0.50, we saved them. Russia, a tightly knit group of independent individualists, has again become a country civilization striving for any victories. And then all the calculations of all the institutes that studied and are studying us failed. How so? Who should they fight for? They must surrender. But we didn't give up. And it was not for Abramovich's yacht that the guys from the Pskov division died, stopping hordes of militants and seeing before their death that they were treacherously abandoned there without support. And from this unconscious craving for victory, from the Russian collective individualist reluctance to give in, from the feeling of humiliation of the country, which gave birth not to slavish obedience, but to rage and thirst for victory. Even if at the cost of his own life. 5. Putin's function as an antivirus program is his role in Russian history. The cleaner, unlike the fencer, does not have the opportunity to stand in one position all the time. Since there is no one person opposing him in the same fencing position and armed with the same sword. Dealing with hurricane devastation requires multidimensional talents, from janitor and gardener to carpenter and mason. By the way, the difference between devastation and breakdown or breakdowns is that everything that could be useful to you is in a broken state. And the path that Russia has traversed over the past 15 years, from complete devastation at all levels of the technological structure and social relations to today's economic and geopolitical capabilities of the country against the backdrop of growing national patriotic self-awareness, the leveling of the Russian cross, and the still timid but growing birth rate of the indigenous population, this is Putin's function successfully performed. However, as is usually the case, everything in this world has two sides. Having accomplished something that is practically impossible, and the level of development of the country in 1999 looked absolutely fantastic, you can always go to the other extreme, try to maintain the current level of success by refusing to move on. The work of a cleaner makes sense only as the first stage of a general construction project. A vacant lot instead of an artistic mess is no better, unless it is a future construction site. Construction is possible only if there are builders. Russia after the USSR, as a future construction site for the creation of a new political, economic and civilizational union within the framework of a single Russian civilization, can only be achieved through the efforts of its own citizens, who are united by a common goal idea that falls into a team of active individualists. The cleaner and guardian must give weight to the builder and warrior. The Russian Federation as a form must be filled with the meaning of Russian civilization. Otherwise it is the death of form and oppression of content. Thank you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, for everything that has already been accomplished. Largely thanks to your achievements, a critical mass of citizens of Russian civilization has been formed. There are fewer of them so far than citizens of the Russian Federation, but we are angry with our enemies and greedy for victories. We are ready to move on, carefully preserving our beloved motherland. To develop within the framework of our own civilization. Recognizing Russian civilization as a single part of the global one, we remember that its rejection in favor of civilizational priorities alien to us almost led us to death. And we remember who and thanks to what fairy tales convinced us of the beneficialness of this death for ourselves. And this lesson, this experience will remain with us forever, as well as an example of how you can avoid your own dismemberment. Sooner or later there will be another president in Russia. The world is now entering an era of choosing what the life of all humanity will be like. A planet divided between multinational corporations, where people without their own states, without family and tribe, fight with each other for the right to get a piece of the pie from their hands. Or peace is a balance of interest of peoples, countries, cultures and civilizations. Which path all of humanity will take depends to a large extent on what choice Russia makes at this stage of its own history. And this choice within Russian civilization largely depends on the first person, now on the president of Russia. Russia, with or without Putin, can survive if it continues to comply with Putin's function. But Russia will be able to develop successfully only if, not forgetting about the antivirus program of protection, it does not forget to turn on the operating system of development. If, without forgetting about maintaining cleanliness and order, we continue to build what our ancestors have been building for 1,000 years, our own Russian civilization, and not mechanically copy predatory methods. Moreover, they are also directed against us. Russia, together with Putin and after Putin, has a wonderful and promising future. If it can continue the line of Putin's function, it can continue moving towards itself, its independence, the preservation of its civilizational peculiarity, contained in the unique experience of the fusion of different peoples and cultures, within which God in the soul and man, as the highest social value of society, coexist in organic unity. You just need to remember that we are Russians and God loves Russia. Conclusion. We can only win by uniting. There is always strength in unity. We see this immutable role in our history, we see it in modern politics, we see it even in everyday situations. A group of a couple of dozen young people can safely go for a walk at a very late hour in the darkest corners of a city park. No one would dare touch them. Russia became a superpower when, in addition to the Russian people, Turks and Caucasians, the peoples of the North and South began to contribute to the development of the country. When did the United States of America become the powerful state that we know today? When did it achieve independence from England, or when did it become a union of 50 states that merged together? To be convinced of the need for unification, we do not need examples from foreign civilizations. Hitler was defeated only because we were together. If there were a bunch of independent states, instead of the USSR, their independence would have ended very sadly. But our people have the ability to unite in a difficult situation, only this helped us survive and develop. It is no coincidence that today we see how quickly in a difficult situation of chaos and lawlessness the people of Russian civilization find each other. How quickly they are able to stand together to solve the problems of protecting their loved ones from attacks. We have a great history and culture behind us. Behind us are great ancestors and great heroes. Our victories have always been greater than our defeats. We have always risen to our feet after being struck by an insidious enemy. It will be so this time too. Our goals are clear: great Russia. Great in all areas and senses. From size to the level of fairness in society. Our geopolitical opponents understand this. That is why the struggle for the situation in Ukraine is so intense. Because Ukraine is part of Russian civilization. This means that the West cannot allow us to get back together. But we will definitely be together. Otherwise we simply won't exist. After all, today's wave of globalization does not sweep the whole world just because there are two cliffs. Two states. Two civilizations. Which are different from the West and do not want and cannot become one. This is the Russian world and China. Only this prevents us from completely globalizing the world, completely subordinating it to the interest of the world's bankers. And this means that we stand not only for ourselves. We stand for the whole world. Without us, it will be much easier to crush China. We stood for peace in 1945. Saved the world in 1812. Nothing has changed. We are for peace again in 2014. And it will always be like this. Because Russia is called upon to preserve the balance of justice in the world. Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library royalib.ru, http://royalib.ru. Leave a review about the book, http://royalib.ru/comment/Starikovi_Ukraina_house_revolutia_revolutia_orugii_dollara.html. All books by the author, http://rolib.iu/author/starikovi_nikolai.html